20. Crazy. He arrived at McGuire Air Force Base near Fort Dix, New Jersey at 7:42 a.m. in the midst of a snowstorm full of barbiturates to stave off his nervousness about flying. It was still dark that early March morning, and standing in the snow in his dress blues and hat, smiling, waving, and illuminated by hundreds of flashbulbs, Elvis was beyond handsome. He was lean, at 170 pounds, and positively glowing. No actor in Hollywood could have approached his magnificence. The Army held a full-scale press conference, and on hand to welcome him were the usual parties. The RCA executives, his music publisher Gene Auerbach, as well as Nancy Sinatra, who presented him with 2 formal lace-fronted shirts, a gift from her father, Frank. The publicity stunt was to billboard his upcoming television special, Frank Sinatra's Welcome Home Party for Elvis Presley, in which a new, cleaned-up adult Elvis would be presented to the public with an imprimatur from the chairman of the board. It was a slick piece of behind-the-scenes machination by the Colonel and came together through connections as simple and obvious as the William Morris Agency and as complicated and opaque as Las Vegas mobsters. As far as the Colonel was concerned, rock and roll was dead, just like Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, Ritchie Valens, and the careers of Jerry Lee Lewis, who had married his underage cousin, and Little Richard, who had gone into the seminary. It was time for Elvis to move on to the next phase of his life as an all-American hero. That's what the military years had all been about. The reporters had their predictable questions, and Elvis had answers. Have 2 years of sobering Army life changed your mind about rock and roll? Sobering Army life? No, it hasn't changed my mind, because I was in tanks for a long time and they rock and roll quite a bit. Are you apprehensive about what must be a comeback? Yes, I am. I mean, I have my doubts. The only thing I can say is that I'll be in there fighting. There's a rumor floating around, Elvis, that you plan to get married soon. Is that true? No, sir. I don't expect to be a bachelor, sir. I just haven't found anyone yet that I want to marry. 2 years earlier, at a similar press conference in Brooklyn, as he was waiting to board the USS Randall, a reporter had asked, "Are you leaving any special girl behind to go overseas?" No, sir, not any special one. There's quite a few of them, though. And there would continue to be quite a few, starting with 3. As Elvis boarded a train 2 days later that would eventually wind its way home to Memphis, he had Anita and Elizabeth waiting for him in Tennessee, and Priscilla pining away in Germany. Priscilla's stepfather didn't quite know what to make of it. It was a very difficult parting, she said years later. He saw how I responded to it. I really went into deep depression. I locked myself in my room. I wanted to be in dark places. I didn't want to go to school. I skipped school. He started realizing there was something wrong with me. I was 14 at the time, but this was more than a teenager's crush. Elvis instructed her to write to him on pink stationery so Joe Esposito could pick her letters out of the endless sacks of mail. The media asked about her at Elvis's Memphis press conference, held March 7, 1960, in Vernon's office just behind Graceland. Some 50 reporters crammed into the small room, where Elvis, dressed with a new European flair and all dark clothes, his hair still a muted blonde — he would dye it Cadillac black 4 days later — sat at his father's desk and swiveled nervously in the chair. He had been awake all night on the train, getting in just before 8 a.m., in the middle of another snowstorm. He looked weary, but boyish. "Now, gentlemen," he announced in mock seriousness, "I have called you here to discuss a very important matter." Everybody laughed. He swiveled some more, looked down, dealt with his emotions. "I just can't get it in my mind that I'm here," he said, looking almost dazed. And then the questions flew, about the music, about the movies. He had 3 to do that year, and would soon start GI Blues, even about his tonsillitis. And then they got down to business. "How about any romance? Did you leave any hearts, shall we say, in Germany?" Elvis, clearly uncomfortable, grinned, glanced away, and looked altogether like a man who'd just been caught doing something he shouldn't. Then he laughed and broke out in nervous titters as he attempted to answer the question. "Not any special one, no. There was one little girl that I was seeing quite often over there. Her father was in the Air Force. Actually, they only got over there a few months before I left. I was seeing her, and she was at the airport when I left. And there were some pictures made of her. But it was no big romance. I mean, the stories came out, the girl he left behind, and all that. It wasn't like that. I mean, I have to be careful when I answer a question like that." Soon it was over. "You'll never know how happy I am to be here," he said, his voice full of feeling. "Somebody asked me this morning, what did I miss about Memphis? And I said, everything." That evening, he saw Anita, who he'd asked to wait at his cousin Patsy's house so they could have a private reunion apart from his family. "There'll be no one else in the room but just us," he'd told her, but he couldn't stand not seeing her and had her come on out with everyone there anyway. He was standing right there in the doorway of the music room where the piano was. He said, "Little," and I just ran over there to him. I was glad to see him, and I guess he was glad to see me. We just embraced for a while. Quite a while. It was a really good time. Happy time. In a month, she would dye her hair black to match his, using his new color, Miss Clairol 51D, black velvet, and he would buy her a diamond necklace. But still, he could not be entirely faithful. He was already seeing 19-year-old Bonnie Bunkley, who had come to the house with her voice teacher, collecting money for a benefit for Whitehaven High School. It seemed to be a compulsion for him, and Elizabeth Stefaniak could not stand it a minute longer. He had bought a yellow Lincoln for her to use, and even gave her driving lessons himself. He had taken her for motorcycle rides and ensconced her in Graceland to help with the incessant flow of mail. But he had also visited the Holiday on Ice show to see the female skaters he had met in Germany, and then invited the whole cast home. And she had covered for him with Anita about his behavior in Germany. However, she could not be his occasional girlfriend, not when there would always be so many others. She was still in love with him, but she needed someone who wanted only her. On March 15th, barely 2 weeks after her arrival, Elizabeth left Graceland, saying she was going to Florida to see her family. Instead, she went to meet Rex's parents. Secretly, she and Rex had decided to marry. It had been Rex who had introduced Elizabeth to Elvis, and now it was Rex who was taking her away. The suggestion had come largely from Minnie May back in Germany. Rex knew better than to hit on one of Elvis's girls, but Grandma had said, "I want you to do it." It showed her love for both of them and her disdain for how her grandson treated the girl. The night before Rex and Elizabeth ran off, Rex went to Elvis and told him he'd thought about what it would be like to work for him, but he was going to go back to his old job. Elvis said he understood and wished him luck. He had rented out the Memphian that night, and Rex was helping him get ready. Elvis was looking into the big walled mirror at himself, Rex wrote in his memoir. I was directly behind him, helping him with his tuxedo suspenders. "Elvis," he said, "would you mind if I took Elizabeth out on a date tonight?" For a minute, Elvis said nothing. Rex held his breath. Clearly a nerve had been struck. Rex wrote, "Rexodus, you know Elizabeth will never love anybody but me," Elvis said, his voice steely. Then he switched gears. "Heck, I'm glad you're taking her out. I know I can count on you to treat her like a lady." That summer, they sent him an invitation to their wedding, but he didn't come, and they never saw him again. It was a confusing time for Elvis. He was home, but home wasn't really home anymore. His mother was gone. He had driven out to see the marker and the big stone angels on her grave the day after he got back to Memphis, and he placed a standing order with Burke's florist to deliver fresh flowers there once a week. But he found it hard to return to the cemetery himself. It was just too painful. He didn't seem like Elvis ever again, his Aunt Lillian observed. He was depressed. He'd say, "I can't go to the cemetery, Aunt Lillian. I can't hardly pass there." To make things worse, Vernon was converting the 3-car garage into an apartment for himself and Dee and her boys. Elvis and Anita were out by the swimming pool the day Vernon moved Dee in. "Daddy," Anita remembers Elvis saying, "are you sure you want to do this? Why do you want to do this?" Anita felt for Elvis. It was hard to watch him struggle with the idea of another woman occupying the house he had bought for Gladys. Eventually, the two of them moved into Mr. and Mrs. Presley's old bedroom. That wasn't very good either. Elvis didn't like that a bit. When Vernon and Dee married in Alabama that July, Elvis was noticeably absent. "She seems pretty nice," Elvis told the Memphis Press Scimitar. "I only had one mother, and that's it. There'll never be another. As long as she understands that, we won't have any trouble." In April, Elvis and his entourage, which now included new members Joe Esposito, Charlie Hodge, and Red West's younger cousin, Sonny, headed for California to make GI Blues for Paramount. Producer Hal Wallace had visited his star in Germany to soak up the ambiance for Elvis's first musical comedy, in which he would play a romanticized version of himself. As Tulsa McLean, a singing army specialist stationed in West Germany, Elvis accepts a bet that he can romance a chilly cabaret dancer, Lily, played by the well-cast Juliette Prowse. Unlike his pre-army films, which were based on previously published novels or stories, GI Blues was written for the screen and follows a predictable and formulaic storyline. Elvis makes the best of the tepid script, in which he babysits an infant and sings at a children's puppet show. But the film telegraphs only ominous things about his future screen persona. Gone are the swiveling hips, the sideburns, the songs of sexual undertow, and Elvis the rebel. In his place is a clean-cut, harmless, and conservative Elvis, designed to appeal to middle America. GI Blues would serve as the prototype for all the Presley musicals to come. From here on out, the public Elvis would become much more what people thought he should be. Off-screen, he was not nearly so neutered, as he pursued 3 actresses on the film: Juliette Prowse, Letitia Roman, and a bit player, Judy Rollins. He had more success with Juliette and Judy, the Italian-born Letitia, 19, telling the press, "He kept asking me to go out with him, but I tell him, no, I don't think it would be a good idea. It would seem too much like a publicity date. Besides, I don't think my parents would approve." Juliette was not his usual physical type. The South African dancer-actress was just under 6 feet tall, and she originally snubbed him on the set. "Man, I'll tell you, that is one cold chick," Elvis remarked to Sonny West. But part of her appeal lay in the fact that she was the girlfriend of Frank Sinatra, who had just devoted his Timex special to spotlighting Elvis's return from the Army, the two trading songs. Elvis sang Witchcraft, Frank sang Love Me Tender, in a generational detente. Just like his character in the film, Elvis was determined to win Juliette over, and carried their love scenes far beyond director Norman Taurog's cries of cut. After a while, Taurog called him over. "You don't have to put your heart and soul into it," he said. "How can you help but put your heart and soul into this?" Elvis answered, defrosting the Ice Queen. "A few days being around him, she just wore right down," says Sonny. "She started cutting up with us." Soon, he and Juliette began spending time in his portable dressing room. Red and Sonny teased him, repeatedly knocking on the trailer door and saying, "Frank's coming, Elvis." Elvis would open that door and say, "Where is he?" and we would just run off laughing, says Sonny. Then one day Sinatra showed up for real. Red went over to that door and whispered, "Elvis, Elvis, here comes Frank, man, I promise you." "Get away from that door, Red." "I mean it. I can't talk too loud or he will hear, man. I can't say anymore." Frank came up and introduced himself, very nice, Sonny remembers. He said, "Hi, is Elvis in?" And we said, "Yes, sir, he's going over his dialogue." Frank knocked on the door, and thankfully Elvis had heard his voice. So when he opened it, Juliette was sitting there prim and proper with her script, and Elvis had his script in his hand like they were going over lines. He said, "Well, hey, Frank," and Juliette said, "Hi, darling." Everything was fine, and she left and went to lunch with him. Afterward, Elvis said, "You sons of guns, you almost cost me there." Their lovemaking was fierce and intense. He said Juliette liked to grab her ankles and spread her legs real wide, reports Lamar. and Juliet would sit on the floor at friends' houses and just hug herself. She was so smitten with him. "He's really one of the most sincere people in the most insincere town on earth," she said. But Elvis dropped her after a few dressing room encounters, not because she was Frank's girl, but because he saw her as smarter and more sophisticated than he, which made him uncomfortable. Their friendship, however, remained, and she played it cool in interviews. He had a wonderful sense of humor. I remember thinking at the time it must be very hard to be him. He had a suite up at the Beverly Wilshire, and he couldn't leave because the place would be surrounded by girls. According to Byron Raphael, around this time, Elvis had a momentary brush with a far more intimidating Hollywood star, Marilyn Monroe. Lamar, of all people, had already chatted up the screen goddess at a party, but Elvis had never seen her. Then, in the early summer of 1960, the two most explosive and legendary sex symbols of their era sized each other up in the street in front of a soundstage at 20th Century Fox and came away unnerved, if not befuddled. Marilyn, who was reeling both from her fractious marriage to celebrated playwright Arthur Miller and from her affair with actor-singer Yves Montand, was co-starring with the latter in Let's Make Love, then in production at Fox. Elvis was due to start principal photography on the period western Flaming Star there in August, and 2 months earlier reported to the studio for wardrobe. Byron said he was with Elvis, Cliff, and Jean, who now hoped to pursue a movie career under the name Al Gino Stone, when the guys began goading him. They were sitting in Elvis's dressing room on the lot. "Man, you gotta meet Marilyn Monroe," Jean started. "Elvis, you've got to ask Marilyn out." "No," he said, seeing Marilyn in a league of her own. "She won't talk to me." Cliff, who would soon be fired over a minor dispute, pushed him harder. "Elvis, man, you're a star. You gotta take the bull by the horns. It's Marilyn Monroe. You've gotta be forceful." Finally, the guys talked Elvis into taking his chances, Byron recalled, and somehow we found out Marilyn's soundstage. Then the four of us made our way over on bicycles. They almost missed her. Marilyn, dressed in a bathrobe and looking distraught, her hair all askew, was suddenly in front of them, coming out of stage 23. Elvis approached her in his usual self-deprecating way, his soft baritone edged in Southern charm. "Hello, my name is Elvis Presley. How are you, Miss Monroe?" Marilyn smiled in a way that said she liked the way Elvis filled out his Oxford trousers, Byron wrote in Playboy. But then her face fell as she took in his companions. Jean, the most pathetic yokel who ever hit Hollywood, and the always embarrassing Cliff, a smooth operator who was so oily he practically left stains when he walked. Monroe, forever insecure, had been searching for class in her choices of husband Miller and lover Montand, and the sight of Elvis's barely civilized friends launched an unmistakable look of fear and disgust. Marilyn's famous suitor, oblivious to her reaction, began his roundabout way of asking for a date, mentioning a party at the Beverly Wilshire, and inviting her to come. "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't," she declined in a breathy rush. She wasn't feeling well, she said, a headache from some kind of allergy, and promptly pulled a bottle of pills from her purse. Elvis was relieved, but he took something from the encounter after all, Byron said. As the studio aide offered Marilyn a cup of water, I spotted the physician's name, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, on the prescription label. Elvis did too. A few weeks later, he had his own script from the good doctor in his dressing room. During the making of GI Blues, Elvis was much more comfortable in the company of a younger female, and if things had turned out differently, Priscilla Beaulieu might never have seen Elvis Presley again. He spent his evenings at a restaurant nightclub in Panorama City called The Crossbow, where Red knew a white rhythm and blues singer from Louisiana named Lance Legault. The club was popular with celebrities, since they could sit unnoticed in the balcony and watch the dancing below. One night, Elvis, then 25, was talking with the owner, Tony Farah, and noticed a picture of Tony's 14-year-old daughter, Sandy, in his office. Elvis said he'd like to meet her, and Tony called and got his sable-haired child on the line. Sandy would remember it was 9:30, while her mother, Mary Lou, fixed the time at more like 2 a.m. Elvis and Sandy chatted for a few minutes, and then he asked the teenager if she could come to the club. "No," Sandy said. "I've got to go to sleep." The girl had school the next day, and her mother refused to drive her up. Mary Lou took the phone. "I said, Elvis, she's only 14. But then he kept bugging. He called again and again. He kept coming to the club until the night I said I will bring her up." The evening Mary Lou made good on her promise, Elvis was there with a date, Kathy Kirsch, who was just breaking into show business and would be crowned Miss Rheingold Beer Queen of 1962. Sandy remembers Kathy was gorgeous, but to her surprise, it was Sandy's hand Elvis held all night. Mary Lou was perplexed. He was paying all of the attention to my daughter, and I'm thinking, gee, she's only 14. What's his problem? Soon they were dancing and making out, nothing more, Sandy says, though even that turned into a problem. In school the next day I'd be embarrassed because my face would be so raw, but when he would hold me in his arms, it was like, if I died now, it would be okay. Mary Lou accompanied them on their first date and then insisted on tagging along for the next two, according to Sandy. He loved my mom. But Elvis continued to puzzle the older woman. One night at the Beverly Wilshire, Elvis and Mary Lou sat in the kitchen, Elvis telling her about Gladys and talking about cooking, among other subjects, while Sandy watched TV. "I want to ask you something, and maybe you will do it," he said. "I would like for you and your daughter to move to Graceland." "You're kidding. Why?" "Well, you said you want to be with her. I'd like to have her at Graceland." "She's too young right now, Elvis." "That's all right. I'm not going to do anything. I just want to raise her. I want her to be there as my wife." Mary Lou went home and told her husband. Oh boy, he raised the roof. He went crazy. He started cursing and yelling. I said, "That's all right. I'm against it too." Sandy would end up dancing in a number of Elvis's films, Viva Las Vegas, Easy Come, Easy Go, Double Trouble, and The Trouble with Girls, and go on dance auditions just so she could see him. She won the part in Viva Las Vegas on her own, with no help from him. Elvis was quite surprised when he saw me on the set. During one of the scenes, he kept bumping my butt with his. He really got off on that. I was making $100, $150 a day. We would have lunch together. A lot of days she would get paid just for sitting there and eating with him. What a great life for a young girl. Their romance lasted 6 years, up until the time he became engaged, she says. Mostly they went to the movies or sat around and ate pizzas, since Elvis had early wake-up calls on the set. We would kiss for hours, and dance for hours, and watch television, and sit at the piano and sing. We had an awful lot of fun. But all through it, there were no expectations on either of our parts. Still, Elvis had his rules. He sent her home for wearing a pantsuit one night. "Don't ever wear pants again." And she was expected not to date anyone else, though he was free to do as he pleased. That caused a bit of friction. Once Sandy got a little older, she had a date with Wayne Newton, and Elvis saw it in the paper. He pulled this article out and said, "Who's this Fig Newton person?" He was really upset about that. Later, the two singers met, and one of them mentioned they were dating the same girl. They came up with the idea to both stop dating me at the same time. It was going to be a joke, but neither one of them did. I continued to date both of them for a very long time. In 1975, Sandy married Wink Martindale, who Elvis had known for more than 20 years. Says Sandy, "I tell my husband he's the best husband, but Elvis was the best kisser." While Elvis was getting to know Sandy, another 14-year-old was thinking of moving on. Elvis and Priscilla were talking on the phone, sometimes all night long, but he had taken 3 weeks to call her. Her mother had said, "Forget him, honey. It was a lovely chapter in your life, but it's over." Priscilla apparently thought that way too. She had already found someone in Wiesbaden, close to her own age, who excited her. Elvis was not the bad boy renegade Priscilla thought he was from his music and movie roles, and that disappointed her. But as Suzanne Finstad wrote in Child Bride, 16-year-old Tommy Stewart, a sophomore at H. Arnold American Military High School, was the actual embodiment of that and reminded her of the boys she'd been involved with back at Del Valle. He had the look, the black leather jacket, the dark slicked back hair, and the intimidation factor. He smoked, he drank, he was a Golden Gloves champion, and he was not afraid to let people know that he was a sort of dangerous guy, his friend Tom Muldoon told Finstad. Most of all, Tom Stewart was sexually active, and not just with girls at school. He was known to hang out in the rough part of town, on Mainzerstrasse, where prostitution was legal. And he was also known to disappear after school with Priscilla before she even met Elvis. After Elvis returned to the States, she began wearing Tom's ring on a chain around her neck. She and Tom Stewart had a very physical affair, says Finstad. I found Tom after my book came out, and he confirmed all that I had been told. He also said that Priscilla's mother was so concerned about the depth and the nature of their relationship that at a certain point she put Priscilla in a chastity belt before her dates with him. All the time Elvis was phoning Priscilla to discuss his insecurities about his film and music career, his father's new bride, and all his other extremely adult concerns. This child, says Finstad, and she was a child, really wanted to be out on a motorcycle with Tom. She was having normal and very intense relationships with boys her age, and she was infatuated with them. Her parents objected to the relationships, not just because some of the boys were negative influences on their young daughter, but also because the Beaulieu's were now reserving her for Elvis. The boys who came to call told Finstad they got the distinct impression that Priscilla's family didn't want them there. Al Corey, who she saw during a brief breakup with Tom, remembered that when he turned up at the Beaulieu's, the parents would say, "Our daughter is with Elvis Presley. You need to find someone else." Priscilla, then, was getting pressed from both sides. When Elvis would phone, he used language that was similar to what he had written to Anita. He repeated to her what he had told her on their last day in Germany. He was expecting her to remain untouched. If she didn't, he told her, the next time he saw her, he would know. Often, after he hung up with Priscilla, Elvis would turn around and call Anita at Graceland. I stayed with Grandma a lot when he was gone, where he would spend time with her between movies. Often, too, he would bring her out to Hollywood to keep him company after a long day of shooting. But when that happened, she tended to cramp his style. Better to leave Anita home most of the time. He was running wild, parsing out his heart, being true to nothing and no one. Lamar Fike sees it a little differently. That few women complained or left him over his promiscuity. There was a lot to go around. He wanted to keep everybody happy. It was the lure. On August 1st, 1960, Elvis began pre-production work on Flaming Star, directed by Don Siegel for 20th Century Fox. The film, based on Claire Huffaker's novel, The Brothers of Broken Lance, appealed to him. After GI Blues, he was back to a serious dramatic role, playing Pacer Burton, a half-breed caught between the feuding worlds of his Kiowa Indian mother and white father. But Elvis was disappointed in the decision to place 4 songs in the film, and director Siegel backed him. To Colonel Parker's chagrin, only 2 songs remained in the final cut. The title number appeared over the opening credits, and Barbara Eden, who played the ingenue, remembers the other song, A Cane and a High-Starched Collar, as little more than Elvis playing guitar and me hopping around the table. Eden was aghast at the Colonel, who set up a desk just inside the soundstage to sell Elvis records and memorabilia to the cast and crew. I watched and I did a double take. I couldn't believe it. But she was impressed with Elvis, who wore dark makeup for the role. God, what a talent he was. Not only was Elvis a natural on a horse, but like a lot of country entertainers, he had a path to emotional truth. He immediately became that character. He believed what he was doing, and he cared so much about doing a good job. He wanted to please. He had his friends and cousins from Memphis around him on the lot, and his father was there. They sat around in chairs and on boxes and sang a little of this and a little of that. It was very pleasant. Everything was easy with him. They also discussed personal things, beginning with their weight. We were both watching what we ate. I said, "Well, you don't have a problem. You're very lean." And he said, No, my mama was heavy, and I take after her. It shows on my face, so I have to be really careful." But what Elvis wanted to know was how Barbara and her actor husband, Michael and Sarah, Broken Arrow, were able to blend marriage and their careers. I said, "It's not tough at all. It's our job. We just go our ways and do it." He said, "I'm really thinking about getting married, but I'm a little worried." I said, "Oh, have you met someone?" He said, "Yeah, I met this girl. She's awful young, though. I don't know." Director Siegel would say that Elvis gave a beautiful performance, but Flaming Star, in which he dies at the end, as in Love Me Tender, was not a commercial hit, and a hastily created EP of the two songs, coupled with 1960s smash hits, It's Now or Never and Are You Lonesome Tonight, peaked at only number 14. Coming after GI Blues with its #1 soundtrack, it was a disappointment, especially since the Colonel was in negotiations for all of Elvis's film and recording contracts. The Mirisch brothers and United Artists were about to pay him $500,000 plus 50% of the profits on each film of a 2-picture deal. Follow That Dream, Kid Galahad. This was no time to be screwing things up. In May 1960, Elvis took the entourage to Las Vegas so he could introduce the newer members to his favorite getaway. Lately, he'd taken to dressing them all in black mohair suits and sunglasses, an early Blues Brothers look, and most certainly his answer to Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack. The press picked up on it and started calling them the Memphis Mafia. The name stuck. By now, most of the guys shared Elvis's fondness for pills, speed or amphetamines in the day, and sleeping pills at night. As in Germany, it didn't matter if you needed to sleep, Joe Esposito says. If he was awake, you had to be awake. That's just the way it was. They'd get up in the morning and take uppers and stay up all night, and then finally crash on sleeping pills. That, says Joe, became a vicious routine. One side effect of the pills was that Elvis's camp became more noisy and disruptive at the Beverly Wilshire. Elvis was always breaking boards in his karate practice, and they were staging 3-hour pie fights and pouring buckets of water on each other now, not just having squirt gun battles. One time we came in and water was dripping from the ceiling, Charlie remembered. In a repeat of the Hotel Grunwald incident, it provoked complaints from management and residents alike, especially after Elvis threw an old cheap guitar down the hall, Charlie said, and a lady looked out and ducked back in because it went right by her head and broke in all pieces when it hit down there. And so Elvis went searching for a house to rent. In October, he found one at 525 Perugia Way in the Bel Air section of Beverly Hills, overlooking the Bel Air Country Club. It was a roundhouse, more or less, as Charlie put it. You could walk all the way around the garden inside it. It was unique. The home was part of the estate of Prince Ali Khan, Pakistan's representative to the United Nations, who had also been actress Rita Hayworth's third husband. Rent was $1,400 a month. In November, Elvis started production at 20th Century Fox on Wild in the Country, his last shot at challenging movie material. In Clifford Odets' intelligent script, adapted from the J.R. Salamanca novel The Lost Country, Elvis is a troubled college kid, Glenn Tyler, whose bad temper gets in the way of his gift for writing. As with King Creole, his character teeters between the good girl, Millie Perkins, and the bad, Tuesday Weld, Hope Lang playing the psychiatrist who helps him find his way. With 3 leading ladies, Elvis was allowed to show his acting range. He was courtly and sweet with Perkins, wild and mischievous with Weld, and wary, then reverential with Lang. Millie Perkins, who would go on to play Gladys Presley in the 1990 television series Elvis, was fresh from the title role in The Diary of Anne Frank. She found the off-screen Elvis very sensitive about who a person was and what they needed. I was very shy, and he treated me with such care, like a hothouse flower. Hope Lang, who co-starred with Marilyn Monroe in Bus Stop in 1956, and garnered an Oscar nomination for Peyton Place the following year, was a replacement on the project for Simone Signoret, who had become ill. Casting Lang instead of Signoret, director Philip Dunn would say, gave the characters a discrepancy of class more than a discrepancy of age, which worked well with their forbidden sexual pull. Lang had never seen Elvis before, except on television, where I wasn't that impressed. I thought he was kind of a greaseball. But I was surprised. We had a wonderful time. We were always cracking up. Hope was a classy Connecticut-born lady, but if Elvis feared she'd be too stuffy, she squelched that notion immediately, and he invited her to the house several times for pizza. While her marriage to actor Don Murray was failing, their divorce would be final the following year. Elvis made no moves on her, treating her only with respect. She, in turn, found him charming. According to Alan Fortas, she teased him about having no liquor in the house, which made him stock the bar on Perugia Way and on location in Napa Valley, California. She also got him drinking screwdrivers. When Elvis developed a boil on his rear end, it hurt so much he couldn't sit down. He had to just kind of lean on his hip or lay in a chair, Alan recalled. The studio sent a doctor to the motel to lance it. "What's the problem?" Hope asked, coming to the room where Elvis was in bed. "I got a boil on my ass," he said, trying to mask his embarrassment. "Let me see," she teased, and yanked back the sheets. Alan, Jean, and Joe exploded with laughter, and Elvis turned as red as his boil. His posterior healed, but Elvis's pride remained wounded. Every few days, Hope would saunter over to him and whisper, "How's your ass?" On location, Elvis secluded himself with blonde wardrobe girl Nancy Sharp, whom he'd met on Flaming Star, but the Ivy Leaguer was a little too proper for him. He was more interested in Tuesday Weld, who looked a bit like a blonde Priscilla. Although known for precocious sex kitten roles, Tuesday was as brilliant as she was volatile. At her father's early death, she became a child model and the family breadwinner, but it proved to be too much. At 9, she had a nervous breakdown, and she began drinking heavily at 10. 2 years later, she tried to commit suicide after falling in love with a homosexual. She was 17 at the time she filmed Wild in the Country. Alan Fortas, who had a crush on her, remembered her as being sweet to everyone in Elvis's camp. But Joe Esposito recalls her salty language and recklessness. Before Elvis moved from the Beverly Wilshire, she decided to chuck a quart of milk out the window of our top-floor suite, just to see it splatter, and got in a shouting match with hotel security when they failed to recognize her. Tuesday also liked to throw things at people from Elvis's moving car. Their romance was apparently hot. Tuesday called him dynamite, real dynamite, but harried. She thought Elvis was very emotionally immature, says Kevin Eggers, a friend from the early days in Hollywood. He lost his temper and physically came at her one day, and she just looked back at him and said, "You make the mistake of touching me and I'll put you in the hospital." She had a great funny line about him. She said, "You know, Elvis looked better with his clothes on." But the simple fact was that one was a bright, talented young woman, and one was a bright, highly talented boy man. He was never comfortable with a woman. He didn't have lovers. He had playmates. Once Elvis realized the girl had a mind of her own, it was over. Tuesday had the nerve to talk back. That was part of Elvis's problem with Christina Crawford, the adopted daughter of screen legend Joan Crawford, who had a small part in the picture. Joe brought her to the house one night, and when he sprung from his seat to light Elvis's cigar, she knocked it out of his mouth. "He shouldn't have to light your cigar," Christina huffed. "I don't mind," Joe said. But Elvis, living on amphetamines and pain pills, was incensed and pulled her by the hair across the coffee table and ordered her to leave, Joe wrote. Wild in the Country, with 4 songs, most of them inserted in odd places, fell short of box office expectations. Director Dunn praised Elvis as an excellent dramatic actor, a natural actor, but lambasted the Colonel for ruining the film with musical numbers. "I shot them so they could be dropped out, and I wish they would drop them out of the prints now. People would see a good movie." In preview, the audience, caught up in the story, laughed whenever Elvis started to sing. Author Salamanca called it a terrible film. Elvis was terrifically depressed and deflated, even during shooting, and knew deep down that the picture would seal the coffin on his hopes to become a serious actor. His resentment toward Parker and the studio heads fueled his drug use and brought dark and brooding changes to his personality. He pulled a 4-shot Derringer on a group of kids who mouthed off at him in traffic in San Francisco on a weekend trip, and soon he would display other aberrant behavior. Joe and Lamar started calling him by a new nickname, Crazy. Later that year, Barbara Hearn got a call from someone in Elvis's inner circle, asking if she would come out to Graceland. Barbara hadn't seen Elvis since Gladys's death, and when she arrived, he was sitting around downstairs with his new pack of friends. She was saddened at their interaction. Whatever he would say, everybody would agree with him. They were talking about his next picture, Blue Hawaii, which would be choreographed by Charles O'Curran, the husband of singer Patti Page. As Barbara remembers it, Elvis said, "Patti Page is the best female singer," and everybody said yes, she was the best female singer. Then he looked at me and grinned, and I said, "No," and he laughed, and he said, "Well, you can count on Barbara to disagree with everybody. Who do you think is the greatest female singer?" I said, "I like Peggy Lee better than anybody else. I thought she was a much better musician. She wrote great songs, and I just liked her style." So we had a big discussion about Peggy Lee versus Patti Page. But in a few minutes, it was back to the same old thing. So I went upstairs and called Mother and asked if she would come get me. Elvis followed her up as she was hanging up the phone. "Why are you leaving?" "Well, honestly, I'm just not having a good time." His face fell, and then he said, "Neither am I." But it was his house, she told him. "You can do something about it." We talked until Mother came, and she was very touched because he just hugged and hugged her and kissed her on the cheek. Later, she said, "I think he knew that was the last time we would ever see each other." And I said, "I think he did too." It would be another 16 years before Barbara would see him, and then only on stage. When she left Graceland that day, she cordoned off a part of her life. If Elvis had just lost a vital female connection, he made another through a chance encounter. In the fall of 1960, the man who had been out of the housing projects only 7 years bought a black Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud II. He was driving down Santa Monica Boulevard one night and caught the eye of 17-year-old Patty Perry, who was on her way to a fraternity party with a girlfriend. That 1 minute in time changed her life. "Let's go see who's in that Rolls-Royce," she said to her friend, and pulled her old clunker of a Buick next to him at a red light. Patty, who was going to beauty school, had been born in the Stamford Hill section of London, England, but she'd been in the States since she was 10, and she knew the drill in L.A. "It's Elvis Presley," she said. "Pretend we don't know who he is." He rolled down the window. "Hey, girls. Hi." Patty played it cool. "You look familiar," she deadpanned. "Do I know you from somewhere?" Elvis laughed and said, "Pull over." He knew she knew who he was, and he liked being noticed, liked the looks on people's faces when they saw him out in public. They chatted for a few minutes. He was on his way to Radio Recorders to do the title track for Flaming Star, and he invited her up to the Perugia Way house later on. He liked her sass and wit, but after the tour of the bedroom, when she told him, "I'm a nice little Jewish girl," Elvis thought of her only as a little sister. "I got on well with all the guys, so they just adopted me, and from that time on, that was it. I was around until he died. Amazing, isn't it?" Patty, Elvis called her Patricia, would become the only female member of the Memphis Mafia. He didn't have a mom or a sister, and I told him the truth. He needed someone to commiserate with him. I became his Jewish mother. He talked baby talk to her, and she nurtured him, did his hair, cut his toenails, rubbed his back, gave him a shoulder to cry on. She never went on the payroll, because she had her hairdressing work 4 days a week in Beverly Hills, and I couldn't give up my complete life to work for him. But she ended up traveling with him part of the week, and practically lived at his LA homes, going over every day after work and having dinner with the gang, and staying until about 1 a.m. When she'd announce she had to go home, Elvis would say, "Don't go home, don't go home." Then he'd send someone to follow her, make sure she got in okay. He was a good, good man. Later, she accompanied him to Memphis, where he took her to Hume's High and Sun Records and Lauderdale Courts and to Gladys's grave, which was the greatest honor he could give me. He teased me. He said, "You're standing on my mother." He had a very, very funny sense of humor. Despite her Jewish background, she ate his deep dish Southern food, red-eye gravy and grits, and even sang gospel songs with him. She loved that music, loved being around him, loved having all those brothers to take care of her. Her parents weren't crazy about the idea. She wasn't dating anyone and just wanted to hang out with Elvis. But they eventually came around to it, seeing that he loved her platonically and that he wasn't a threat. Any other girl who came to the house had to accept her too, even as some tried to muscle her out. On Perugia, girls would come up to the house and I'd sit next to Elvis on the couch. And as soon as I'd get up to go to the bathroom, some other girl would run over to sit next to him. But there was no displacing her. She was a lifer. Elvis was like my family. We grew up together. He brought me up, and he liked bringing up his women. He adopted me and protected me and wouldn't let anybody hit on me. Even when I was in my 30s, Elvis used to say, "Patty is family. She doesn't fool around." I'd say, "Hey, I can fool around." But living with Elvis was really difficult. You had to be mother, sister, and confidant. Patty was a lucky girl, she says. But you know what? He was really lucky to have me too. All around him now, there were new beginnings and sudden endings, and they wasted no time as 1961 rolled in. On February 4th, Junior Smith, Elvis's frequently frightening cousin, died. "The way he would look at you, God, it would make your bladder weak," says Lamar. Elvis kept him going by adding him to the entourage, like his brother Gene. But then, when Elvis went away to the army, Junior just stayed drunk, trying to wash away his flashbacks of shooting civilians in Korea with a Browning automatic rifle. He'd get that stare. Oh, everybody would say he's remembering stuff again. Then he started mixing alcohol and drugs, popping sleeping pills and amphetamines that Elvis gave him. The combo did him in. The night he died, he went on a bender with his uncle Travis Smith. Travis went on to his bedroom and passed out, and Junior went to Billy's room and lay down on the bed. When Billy came home around 11:30, he realized Junior was there and started to crawl over him when he saw something on the bed. Well, he's done thrown up, Billy thought, and went into the living room to sleep on the couch. The next morning, Billy awoke with a start. It was eerie, the way he felt. He just knew something was wrong. He went in and looked at Junior. And my heart liked to stop. He had thrown up, but the stuff on the bed had some blood mixed with it, and it seemed like it had come out of his nose. Billy went over and touched him. God almighty, he's dead. Now Billy ran in to his parents. I said, "Daddy, I think Junior's dead." He said, "No, he's all right." Then he went in and I heard him say, "Oh my God, he is." Junior had choked on his own vomit. Travis called Elvis, who hurried over with Anita. "We were the first there," she says. "A terrible sight, but that was just the first tragedy that happened in that family." Within the next few years, there would be more, some macabre. Billy's brother Bobby, who had gotten a Section 8 in the National Guard for swallowing safety pins and puncturing his intestines, would be unable to handle Elvis's fame and take rat poison and die. And Junior and Jean's brother Robert, who worked for a chrome plating company, fell up to his waist in a vat of hot liquid chrome. It cooked him. Billy would remember that Elvis was extremely hurt by Junior's death. It was too soon to be having another funeral in the family, and Elvis thought he should have done more for him. Still, he was glad Junior was finally out of his private hell. At the house, Eddie Fadal remembered. He just kept saying, "It's all over, Junior. It's all over." It affected Elvis, says Joe. He started to stay away from booze. Pills were one thing, because the doctor approved them, but drinking had killed his mother and now Junior and other relatives on the Smith side. Junior's death had a ripple effect with Elvis, a fascination with cadavers and a thirst for knowledge about death. When Junior was still at the Memphis funeral home, being embalmed, Elvis and Billy made a nocturnal visit. We went up about 3 or 4 a.m. The door was locked, but a guy let us in the back way. We viewed the body, and then Elvis said, "Let's ease on back and see how they do this." They went on down a dim hallway, passing through a casket display room, and followed a noise through the dark. Billy became frightened, but Elvis led him on, and finally they happened on 2 morticians. One was working. He had rock and roll music playing, and the other was lying in a casket, snoring. "May I help you?" asked the one. "I'm Elvis Presley. You've got my cousin up there, and I was just fascinated by all this." "You're not supposed to be here," he said. But because it was Elvis, he and Billy got a tour and a brief education on the fine points of embalming. After that, Elvis would sometimes take new girlfriends to the funeral home in the middle of the night. It was a test of sorts. He'd whip back the sheets covering the corpses, and if they could handle that, they could handle anything. Joe puts it down to Elvis's interest in the unknown, part of his exploration of God and heaven and the afterworld. But he also admits he would do things to shock people, anything out of the ordinary. Bottom line, says Joe, Elvis was not a normal human being. He was just bizarre. 21. Going Under. While Elvis was busy with his twin obsessions, music and movies, pills and women, the Colonel worked feverishly to polish his client's image as a patriot. When Elvis was first discharged from the Army, Parker had wrangled Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver into reading a tribute to the new sergeant into the congressional record. "To his great credit, this young American became just another G.I. Joe," the senator said in puffed-up prose. "I, for one, would like to say to him, yours was a job well done, soldier." Tennessee Governor Buford Ellington and Memphis Mayor Henry Loeb now joined forces to declare February 25, 1961, Elvis Presley Day. It was historic in more ways than one. At a special luncheon at the Hotel Claridge, RCA presented the singer with a diamond watch to honor record sales of more than 75 million. And later on, at Ellis Auditorium, he played 2 Memphis charity shows, his first live performances in 3 years. The hometown paper raved that Elvis successfully blended Negro cottonfield harmony, camp meeting fervor, Hollywood showmanship, beatnik nonchalance, and some of the manipulations of mass psychology. Of the $51,612 raised, $47,823 would go to 38 foundations and funds in the Bluff City, the remaining money to the Elvis Presley Youth Center in Tupelo. The contribution built on Elvis's yearly donation to a long list of Memphis area charities, with input from the governor. Fewer than 2 weeks later, Elvis stood before the Tennessee State Legislature in Nashville. His appearance, staged by the Memphis delegation, was designed to thank him for his financial contributions and to raise the city's profile around the world. Governor Ellington, born in Mississippi and reared on gospel music like Elvis, also hoped the event would draw attention to tourism throughout the state. The governor's teenage daughter, Anne, attended college 30 miles away at Middle Tennessee State University. She skipped classes that day to go to the Capitol building, where her father would first meet Elvis in the governor's suite of offices. The event had been well publicized, and all of Capitol Hill was jammed with cars and people standing outside. Everybody hoped to get a glimpse of Elvis. As Anne remembered, the governor's staff had been waiting quite a while, seated around the conference table, when all of a sudden the door opened and here this entity was standing in the doorway with this black suit on, and every hair immaculately combed. There was absolutely dead silence in the room. It was just like somebody had sucked all of the air out of it. Elvis shook hands with Governor Ellington and sat down at the end of the table and talked a minute. Then, when the sergeant-at-arms announced it was time to go, Elvis hit on the governor's daughter. "You're going, aren't you?" he asked. The pretty blonde said no. She wasn't scheduled to be part of it. "I need for you to go," he said. Anne blushed and broke into a smile. "I don't think I am supposed to go. There's not a seat up there for me." She knew that seats were at a premium. But Elvis didn't care about any of that. "Yeah," he said. You've got to go." He grabbed her hand, and when Anne looked at her father, the governor nodded his approval. Then out they went, through the crowd, down the hallway, up the steps, and down into the opening of the legislature. After the governor and the Speaker of the House made their remarks, Elvis went up to the podium. Of course, the people just went bananas. You could hardly hear him because of the screaming, Anne says. Before he left that day, Elvis became a Tennessee colonel, and he thanked the legislature for the finest honor I've ever received. After that, Elvis went to the state penitentiary to see Johnny Bragg of the Prisonaires, whose long-ago newspaper profile had led him to Sam Phillips. Anne went with him, and then Elvis, with Joe and Alan in attendance, took her to the governor's residence, where they sat a while and talked. It was kind of awkward for both of them, Anne thought, and before long Elvis turned and said goodbye and headed off to Memphis. The next weekend, he was back to record at RCA's Studio B. He called ahead and asked if she were going to be in town, and she invited him back out to the residence, where a uniformed highway patrolman greeted him at the door. Elvis thought that was so neat. They talked for the better part of the evening, just the two of them in a small living room downstairs. He reminisced about Mississippi and talked about the movies he had done and hoped to do, telling her each one was a stepping stone, and that he wanted to get scripts that would show the talent that he knew he had. The hour grew late, and Anne's parents were upstairs. About 2 o'clock, there was a knock on the door, and the sergeant who was on duty at that time said, "Miss Anne, the governor's just called down and says he thinks it's time for the gentleman to go." Elvis rose then, saying, "Well, I'll see you tomorrow evening," which was an invitation for her to go to the recording studio with him. After he left, the two patrolmen were absolutely rolling on the floor laughing, and I couldn't figure out why. And then the sergeant told me, "Well, that wasn't exactly what your father said. What he said was, it was time for the hound dog to go." Over the next 2 days, Elvis recorded the mellow Something for Everybody album, Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana from the old days sitting in with the Nashville A-Team, which included Hank Garland, guitar, Bob Moore, bass, Buddy Harmon, drums, Floyd Kramer, piano, and Boots Randolph, sax. Soprano Millie Kirkham, who often worked with the A-Team, came in for backing vocals, and Elvis was glad to see her again. He had loved her distinctive high harmony since they recorded Blue Christmas together in 1957, and he was always respectful in her presence. On their first session together, she was 6 months pregnant, and he asked for a chair for her. When one of the players used foul words, Elvis brought it to his attention, saying, "Please watch your language. There's a lady present." Now he was equally protective of Anne, camouflaging her to bring her into the studio, where she sat off to the side or the back. He would invite her there more than once, and, as if for inspiration, he always wanted me where he could see me, or at least acknowledge that I was standing behind him. That first night, he played her Can't Help Falling in Love, which he was about to record in California for the soundtrack of Blue Hawaii. In time, he would try to shield their relationship from the press. When it got time for us to leave the governor's residence, I always had a highway patrolman with me, who drove me over to the motel where Elvis was staying, and then we switched cars, and I would go to the studio with him. Then, when everything in the parking lot was quiet and nobody was there, we would run in. We would be there till early in the morning, and then go get some breakfast or come back to the residence. Then he'd turn around and head back for Memphis. Rumors flew that Elvis was secretly courting Anne and that the two were a heavy item. I think any female who had an opportunity to sit down and meet him, even for 5 minutes, would find a love for him that words cannot describe, she says. But she didn't want an affair or a fling or any kind of romantic situation, really. It wasn't that I was trying to create a spot in his life for me. We enjoyed our friendship. Aside from their physical attraction, Elvis took a parental interest in her and apparently saw her as a twin substitute as well. When he told her, "I need for you to go," into the legislature, he meant it. As he had done with Priscilla, he formed a bond with her based on mutual loss and displacement. He came into my life at a time that was very crucial for me, Anne says. Her father's political career had taken a 13-year-old girl from a farm life and put me in a place that I was not accustomed to, was not prepared for. Elvis had the same kind of situation, just in a different world. He helped me adjust more than anybody else. I could tell him things that I'd never told anybody. In turn, he gave her advice on how to deal with situations, like how not to let hurts get to you so bad that you couldn't deal with them. He had already experienced so much of that, and I was just beginning it. But while they came from similar backgrounds, they both pretty well knew where life was going to take us, and that Anne was not meant to be the wife of an itinerant entertainer. And so the romance faltered, even as they continued to care about each other. I always knew that if I ever needed him at any point in time, all I had to do was pick up the phone and call, and he would be there. A week after the Nashville studio sessions, Elvis was on the Paramount lot in Los Angeles to begin work on Blue Hawaii, which would co-star 35-year-old Angela Lansbury as his mother. After the flat response to Elvis's last two dramas at 20th Century Fox, Hal Wallis had brought in two proven entities for the return to the musical format. Hal Cantor, the writer-director of Loving You, who would pen the story, and director Norman Taurog, who had been at the helm of G.I. Blues and would go on to direct 7 more Presley pictures. Once again, Cantor drew on a piece of Elvis's autobiography to shape the framework. As Chad Gates, Elvis is fresh out of the Army, but instead of returning to the Mississippi Delta, he goes home to the 50th state. Hawaii had been admitted to the Union only 2 years before, and the milieu was wondrous to most moviegoers. It was also a place dear to Colonel Parker's heart, since Parker had spent his first hitch in the service at Fort Shafter. As the plot unfolds, Chad rejects the notion of going into the family business. His father supervised a pineapple company, preferring to work as a tourist guide along with his Hawaiian girlfriend, Maylee, Joan Blackman. Romantic diversion comes in the form of Abigail, Nancy Walters, there with her underage charges. "Mr. Gates, do you think you can satisfy a school teacher and 4 teenage girls?" she asks. "Oh, I'll sure try, ma'am," Chad answers. On March 25, 1961, the cast and crew flew to Honolulu for location shooting, but the Colonel had also booked Elvis to perform a benefit show that evening to raise money for a memorial to the USS Arizona, the battleship in which 1,177 seamen were entombed after the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had approved the creation of the memorial in 1958, while Elvis was in the Army, and Parker had worked feverishly behind the scenes to attach himself and his client to the cause. The show, in Honolulu's Block Arena, where the audience never stopped shrieking, not for 1 minute, according to Joan Blackman, raised more than $62,000. Elvis, wearing the jacket to his gold lame suit, was both energized and uninhibited. At 26, he was also at his physical peak, looking lean, hard, and well-tanned, after producer Wallace issued strict orders through Colonel Parker that his star get in shape, watch his weight, and use a sun lamp. Colonel Parker had booked country comic Minnie Pearl as an opening act for the show, but until they landed at the Honolulu International Airport, she hadn't realized how encapsulated Elvis was in his fame. As 3,000 screaming females rushed to surround the plane, I began to get these chilling feelings that maybe I didn't want to be all that close to Elvis. The fans were all along the route he was taking to the Hawaiian Village Hotel, and my husband was afraid that we'd be trampled trying to get inside. I felt myself being lifted completely off my feet by all these people. On the afternoon following the show, Minnie, aka Sarah Cannon, joined some of the musicians down on Waikiki Beach, cavorting and kidding and having a big time. We got to talking about how we wished Elvis could come down and be with us, and we turned and looked up at his penthouse, which was facing the ocean. He was standing on the balcony, looking down at us, this solitary figure, lonely-looking, watching us have such a good time. He was literally a prisoner because of the fans. We sat there on the beach and talked about how it would be. What a price you pay for that sort of fame. Elvis had a different experience from the balcony when 19-year-old cast member Darlene Tompkins visited his penthouse. His buddies had gone out onto the wide patio which overlooked the beach, and they started yelling to him, "Elvis, come out here. Some of the girls on the beach want to see you." I realized he was ignoring them, and I finally said, "Elvis, those are your fans. You really should go out there and let them see you." He hesitated and then said, "I probably shouldn't," whereupon I asked, "Well, why not?" He kind of sighed for a second and then said, "Okay, come on out here with me, and I'll show you what always happens." The two of us walked out onto the patio, and an immediate cheer went up from the crowd of people, mostly beautiful young women. No sooner had we gotten to the railing before a number of the young females began taking their bikini bathing suit tops off and waving them around in the air, while the ones wearing one-piece suits pulled their tops down, trying to catch his attention. Elvis immediately yelled, "Come on now, girls, don't do that," which was quickly met by a resounding, keep doing it," from Elvis's guy friends. Elvis looked sheepishly at me and in an embarrassed tone said, "That's what the girls always do." Darlene, who played one of the teenagers, had first run into him in the hallway of the hotel, where he said, "Hi, how are you?" in a very soft, friendly voice. She doesn't remember what either of them said after that because I was so nervous and my legs were so wobbly I was afraid I was going to fall to the floor right there in front of him. I just remember thinking as we stood there chatting, I can't believe how beautiful he is, more so than in any picture I've ever seen of him. It was an experience I'll never forget. Later, they expanded their friendship to kissing, though Elvis also became interested in Pamela Austin, then billed as Pamela Kirk, who played another of the students on tour with their teacher, and who would also appear in a later Elvis movie, Kissin' Cousins. His more intense love interest was his scripted girlfriend, Joan Blackman, who bore a slight resemblance to both his mother and to Priscilla, Joe Esposito thought. Joan understood the attraction. He was always looking for someone with black hair and blue eyes, and I had that naturally. She was cast in Blue Hawaii only 11 days before shooting, replacing Juliette Prowse, who made too many demands for Hal Wallace's liking. The day she walked on the set, Joan says, Elvis approached her and said, "Man, you're beautiful." Joe counts their romance as one of Elvis's real relationships, though it was brief. We had rooms next to each other in the hotel, and for weeks we just about lived together, she has said. But she was serious about her work. If it came to a toss-up between meeting Elvis for dinner or getting my sleep because of having to be on the set the next day, my work always won. She also objected to the entourage. It's hard to talk with 8 people at a time and really relate. Joan, who had competed in beauty contests as a young child and began singing and dancing professionally at age 11, claims to have met Elvis at Paramount in 1957 and dated him for a year before he went into the Army. There was something between us. He had really liked me when I knew him before, and some of that rekindled on the set. Had I not been dating someone else at the time we filmed, things could have gotten serious between us. Blue Hawaii, for all its lush tropical settings and sentimental romance, was not a particularly fun movie to shoot, Joan says, as Hal Wallace was not the kind of person that you had a good time with. Our sets were very serious. In certain dialogue scenes, Elvis was very nervous. He used to hold my hand until I thought he'd never let me go. To break up the tension whenever something went wrong on the set, particularly if one of the guys accidentally ruined a take, Elvis would cup his hands around his mouth and mimic a loudspeaker. "Flight 247 now leaving from Honolulu to Memphis with Charlie Hodge on board." He needed to do stuff like that because he was not at ease in front of the camera, in Joan's estimation. On the other hand, Joan thought that Elvis was too passive. He rarely asked to change dialogue that he found difficult, and unlike in his pre-Army films, he usually accepted direction he didn't agree with, rather than question it. It takes a lot of courage to take a chance and fight for it, to say, "I want this." I don't think he could handle that. He didn't want to make waves. Joe Esposito blames it on Elvis's military experience and his renewed respect for authority. "The Army calmed him down, but it hurt him more than it helped him, because it tamed him too much. When he came out, he became more oriented to do what he was told. and because of his upbringing, he could never stand up to a person who was older than he was. He could scream and yell and chew us out, but he was taught to always respect his elders. That hurt him in his career. He should have said, "This is what I want to do. Let's try it, and if it doesn't work, I'll understand." That's why he made so many mediocre movies. He particularly put too much trust in director Taurog, Joan thought, as well as other directors down the line. Had he gone along with some of his own instincts, he might have done some different kinds of films. Blue Hawaii, Elvis's first bikini picture, followed the musical format of GI Blues, 14 songs in all, 3 more than even its model. But it easily surpassed it at the box office and quickly recouped its $2 million budget. In placing Elvis in an exotic locale and wedding a plethora of romance to nonstop music, the film's biggest hit, Can't Help Falling in Love, fell just short of number 1, and the soundtrack topped the charts, selling 2 million copies in the first year alone. Wallace had perfected his winning Presley formula. The popularity of Blue Hawaii doomed Elvis's chances of ever returning to serious dramatic fare, and only rarely did he even attempt to venture beyond the film's stifling structure. Nearly all the Elvis movies produced after the release of Blue Hawaii would be assembled around his personality, or Hollywood's conception of it, just as films had once been fashioned around such female stars as Mae West and Shirley Temple. The Wallace productions were the last Hollywood vehicles guaranteed to pull a reliable gross solely because of their star. This led the producer himself to remark, "A Presley picture is the only sure thing in show business." Elvis's next film, Follow That Dream, for United Artists, also sent him to a sunny clime, this time to Crystal River, Florida. Based on Richard Powell's novel Pioneer Go Home, and produced by David Weisbart, Love Me Tender, the film attempted to meld comedy and social satire. But in failing to capture the humor of rural Southerners, director Gordon Douglas ended up with something akin to a Lil Abner cartoon, an embarrassing mismatch of a movie about a blended family, welfare, and homesteading. Still, there were highlights. Elvis was really good in that film, in the estimation of his co-star, Anne Helm. I thought he was a wonderful actor. He had a scene where we were in a courtroom, and they had hired all the townspeople to be extras. He turned to them and gave a very emotional speech about why the children should not be taken away from us. He was so believable that he had the townspeople in tears. It was interesting to see, because I had never thought about him as an actor. When Elvis learned that he would be spending nearly 3 weeks in Florida, he sent word to Jackie Rowland, his Jacksonville sweetheart, asking her to come to him. She was 19 now, but her mother still frowned on her friendship with Elvis and had refused Gladys's invitation to visit Graceland. Now, Marguerite waffled on whether she would let her daughter go to Crystal River. "You will go, and I will take you." By the time they finally arrived, says Jackie, Elvis had gone and left a message that he couldn't wait for me any longer. I knew at that point that it was a hopeless cause for the two of us. Never again would she receive an invitation from him, though he would have RCA send her albums into the 1970s. Elvis had his hands full of women in Crystal River as it was. He was romancing both of his co-stars, the voluptuous Toronto-born Helm and the Southern beauty Joanna Moore. Of the two, he had an easier time with the down-to-earth Helm, whom he allowed to become one of the guys and join his poker games with the Memphis Mafia. I lost money. One time I had to write a check to Elvis to cover my loss. He didn't cash that check for a long time. In many ways, her character mirrored Elvis's fantasies about Sandy Farrah and Priscilla Beaulieu. As Holly Jones, Anne played a live-in orphan who grows up under Elvis's protective eye, maturing from a scrawny teen to a young woman. "You know anything about sex, Holly?" his character asks. I really fell for Elvis. I mean, who wouldn't? We did have a romance, and it was quite wonderful. She wrote poetry about him during the day, and at night they went for drives in his Cadillac, flying through silhouetted palms and scrub oak along State Road 40, Elvis fiddling with the radio dial. It was so strange when Hound Dog would come on, and there I was sitting next to him. The evenings usually ended up with more than a romantic drive, though. He really liked sex. A lot of nights I didn't go back to my own bungalow. I felt a little ashamed about it the next morning, because I knew that the people on the set realized what was going on. At the same time, I had fun, and it was special. Though she had been a showgirl at New York's Copacabana nightclub, she hadn't realized the extent of Elvis's fame until she accompanied him to Weeki Wachee Springs, Florida, on July 30th, 1961, for a special ceremony honoring his achievements. There, the Colonel, reliving his Florida carnival days, arranged for a mermaid show of what the old hustler dubbed the Elvis Presley Underwater Fan Club. Thousands of people showed up, and they were behind a wire fence to keep them away from him because they were crazed, Helm remembers. I was really overwhelmed by it because I'd never seen such madness for someone. She was equally surprised that Elvis stayed and signed autographs for several hours. I was so touched by that. He really revered his fans. He was lovely with them. They brought out all the sweetness and cream in him, she thought, watching him walk along the fence, talking with people. She continued to see him when they returned to California, but she found it more difficult to date him there, where he no longer knocked on her door and brought her flowers, and where his parties consisted of carpet-to-carpet women, mostly young girls. One night at the piano, he said something to her that angered her, and she pulled the piano lid down on his hands. It hurt his finger, and he was really mad for the first time at me. She apologized, but it didn't seem to help, and the next day she went out and bought a gag gift, a big rubber thumb, and sent it to him with a note. Still, I never heard from him again. She knew to give up and to cherish what now seemed like a shipboard romance in Florida. In California, he had many lives. He had many women around him. It wasn't like Crystal River, where I had him all to myself every night. But that was only because Elvis had become frightened of Joanna Moore. According to Joe Esposito, her reputation for promiscuity preceded her on the Follow That Dream set, and sure enough, they went off together. The affair was short-lived, however, because Elvis found her strange and emotionally fragile. She spoke in a voice that was both high-pitched and tense, and she was far too effusive with both the guys and with Elvis, declaring her love for him almost immediately. When she became clingy, he quickly moved on to Anne. However, when filming resumed in California, Joanna was not to be ignored. She showed up at Elvis's door late one night, looking terrible, as if she'd just climbed out of bed, Joe remembered. Slurring her words, she demanded to see Elvis. When Joe told her Elvis was asleep, she began crying and tried to force her way into the house. She passed out in Joe's and Charlie's arms, and after Charlie got a wet cloth and revived her, Joe asked her what could be so important that couldn't wait until morning. "Elvis got me pregnant," she moaned, "and I took a bunch of sleeping pills. I have to talk to him." Charlie and Joe took her to the UCLA emergency room, where doctors pumped her stomach. The next morning, the guys told Elvis what had happened. "Make sure you call and find out how she's doing today," he said. "I knew that girl had problems. That's why I stopped seeing her." As for the pregnancy, Joe says, the doctors saw no evidence of it. On his next picture, Kid Galahad, a remake of the 1937 boxer film of the same title, Elvis was once more romantically paired with Joan Blackman. He had requested her on the film, but by the time it went into production, he was also involved with 23-year-old Connie Stevens, who he'd seen in the Hawaiian Eye television series. As soon as he asked her out, "I knew," she says, "this was a fellow who could break your heart." Still, she couldn't resist him. He was just so beautiful. He had mischievous eyes that darted around the room. She saw him on and off for 2 years. "I really cared about him. I cared what happened to his life." And so she worked on him to find a way to live a more normal existence, to not be so isolated and such a prisoner of fame. He no longer walked around with a wallet. Elvis never carried a dime in his pocket, no matter where he went, says Joe. And when it came to women, it was as if he had forgotten how to date. As for being mobbed, once he got past the gate girls, who waited all day and night for him to come out, Surely he could just go to dinner and a movie in the film star capital of the world, couldn't he? He finally listened to me long enough, and we went to Grauman's Chinese theater, and I thought, I'll never put this guy through this again. I remember Joe put money in his pocket, and he was nervous as hell. And we went out in the car, and he wore his favorite cap, and we ran out of gas. He was just panic-stricken. Don't worry, we'll push this car. They managed to get the car into a gas station, but as he had done in Germany, he missed the beginning of the picture because he was afraid too many people would recognize him going in, and he missed the end of the picture so they could get out without being bothered. Sure enough, we got out into the car and we were going home, laughing about the whole night, and he went to reach for his favorite cap and it was gone. That was so typical, people wanting a piece of him all of the time. Connie wanted something too, of course. She wanted a part of Elvis's heart. But one of the things I knew instinctively was that he probably couldn't be captured, and shouldn't be captured, because he was so special that he needed to be in the world. He was a very dear, precious person. Of all the men she dated, she would later marry Eddie Fisher, Elvis was her father's favorite. He was one of the loves of my life, she admits. I could have spent a lifetime with him, and I knew it was never to be. Not only were the other women a problem, she says, but to be with him, you had to follow the crowd. Like Joan Blackman, I got tired of going out with 11 guys for dinner. By spring 1962, the entourage included Joe, Gene, Lamar, Alan, Billy, and Ray Chief Sitton. Sonny, Red, and Charlie were still part of the mafia, though they all sought independent work. Sonny and Red in Hollywood, and Charlie with country singer Jimmy Wakely. Cliff would continue to be hired and fired with regularity, and Lamar would soon be gone, though only temporarily, after a blow-up with Elvis. Patty still worked her hairdressing job, but she went wherever Elvis was 3 days a week and remained a fixture at the house whenever he was in California. And Marty Lacker, who had first started coming up to Graceland in 1957, but had just now officially joined the group, would weave in and out in the early 1960s. Marty would quickly develop a fondness for pills, mostly downers to round off the high ends of his intensity. Elvis now began traveling cross-country in a 1962 Dodge motorhome, replete with double bed, 2 bunks, a kitchen, and air conditioning. He paid in excess of $10,000 for it and planned to have George Barris, customizer to the stars, who'd transformed Elvis's 1960 Cadillac limousine into a solid gold Vegas-ready extravaganza, add the finishing touches. And there were other changes. At the end of 1961, Elvis decided he'd outgrown the Perugia Way house. Neighbors complained that the girls out front made the place look like a male bordello, and moved to another rental property, an elegant Italian villa just around the corner at 10539 Bellagio Road. The mansion was very grand, says Joe, and came with a butler. They had been there only a few days, according to Alan Fortis, when Elvis mourned the fact that he hadn't brought along the source of much of his fun on Perugia Way, a 2-way mirror, which he used to spy on the guys and their dates in the den. It was small, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, but it fed Elvis's growing interest in voyeurism, and the guys loved it too, even if the women didn't. Tuesday Weld came over one time and looked through it and called them all a bunch of adolescents. On Bellagio Road, Sonny got the idea to install a new mirror in the cabana, where female guests changed from their street clothes into their bathing suits. It was huge, the size of a picture window, 5 by 5, but it worked only at the back of the cabana, which meant the guys had to crawl under the house to see anything. The first time girls came over for a swim, Alan was surprised to see Elvis with dirt on his cheeks and a big smear across his forehead. "I can't believe you crawled under there. Hell, Elvis, they'll let you look." Elvis thought about it for a second. "Yeah," he said, "but it's a lot more fun this way." The Bellagio Road home was the scene of many memorable parties, particularly as Elvis had recently acquired a 40-pound chimpanzee named Scatter, the retired star of a children's TV show in Memphis. He was a perfect party animal, since he naturally gravitated toward women, sticking his head up girls' skirts, unbuttoning their blouses, and hiding behind the bathroom door to scare the wits out of them. The first time Patty Perry came over after Elvis brought Scatter out to California, he came in the room screeching, with his hands up, every hair standing on end, and Patty thought he was going to attack her. Scatter only wanted to look up her skirt, but when she told him to stop and he didn't, she said, "You do that one more time and I'm going to knock the hell out of you." Naturally, he did it again, Billy Smith says, and Patty hit him under the chin, and he did a backflip and landed on the couch, dazed. He looked at her like he couldn't believe it, in Billy's description. Scatter had a head like a bowling ball, but she put a dent in it. Alan and Sonny found his antics hilarious. Sometimes they sent him into a bedroom where a couple was making love, and Scatter would get excited and jump on the guy's back. Elvis thought it was funny, though he was embarrassed when the chimp would masturbate in front of his female guests. "Believe it or not, we did not teach him to do that," says Marty Lacker. But it fascinated Elvis, who was becoming more and more interested in all things sexual. Soon, he would ask Alan to have soft porn films made for him, often of two girls wrestling in white cotton panties. It was a flashback of sorts to his childhood turn-on, seeing his two aunts dancing together and waving their skirts up in the air. Patty says it's important to remember the context of such things. "Listen, you gotta realize," she says, 19-year-old truck driver overnight becomes superstar and super stud, which he wasn't. Scatter's days were numbered, especially when he became destructive. He tore up the drapes in hotel rooms, punched a hole in Elvis's 35mm projection screen, and bit the hired help. One evening, he got out and ruined a neighbor's fancy cocktail party, the guests jumping up on the tables and the backs of couches as he roared through the house screaming, "Woo, woo, woo." Alan usually took care of him, but because he had no one specific master, Scatter simply couldn't be controlled. He eventually brought out the worst in the guys. Lamar hated him and poked him with a cattle prod, and Elvis whacked him with a pool cue. Eventually, they took him back to Memphis, where he lived in a cage behind Graceland. Even there, he was a little terror, tearing the wig off a maid named Daisy when she went to feed him. He died not long after, hanging on to the side of the cage, hard as a brickbat, with his long arms out and his legs bowed. Elvis always wondered if Daisy had poisoned him. Elvis's own treatment of Scatter was indicative of how his behavior continued to change in the wake of his frustration over his film career and his escalating dependency on drugs. In 1962, also on Bellagio Road, his temper began to show more and more with the women who attended his parties. He got so mad at an actress that he picked up a watermelon and hurled it at her like a missile and hit her in the rear. But the more famous incident came with a girl named Judy, who Elvis thought failed to mind her manners. She had tried to get his attention, and when he went downstairs to play pool, she followed him and continued her pursuit. Finally, he had to say, "Look, I'm shooting pool, and I'm going to finish this game before I do anything else." With that, she took the cue ball off the table, and he flushed with anger. "If you do that again, they'll have to surgically remove it," he heatedly told her. She stared him down. "You're a smart-ass son of a bitch, aren't you?" No one called Elvis a son of a bitch. To him, it was a slur against Gladys, and he launched the cue stick before he even knew what he had done, hitting the girl in the chest near the collarbone and almost harpooning her. She fell right over, Joe remembers. Elvis rushed to see about her, though he didn't apologize, and he had one of the guys take her to the doctor. "That was the first time I saw him really, really mad, just unbelievably mad," says Joe. Later, he cried. In Lamar's view, Elvis had no parameters. He moved the lines of behavior wherever he wanted them, and if he went too far, he moved them out farther. His discipline was non-existent, and the more insulated he got, the stranger he got. In March 1962, Elvis began pre-production on Girls, 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 his first picture for Hal Wallace after Blue Hawaii. Wallace sent him back to Hawaii for location shooting, and again assigned 63-year-old Norman Taurog to direct. The producer was now certain that Elvis was best showcased as an entertainer specializing in light musical comedies, and not as an actor. To that end, Elvis would begin a long series of movies in which he would play the carefree bachelor with an offbeat occupation. The plot almost always turned on some feeble predicament over which he would triumph, winning the girl in the process. For Girls, 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 he was cast as a charter boat pilot who moonlights as a lounge singer to buy a sailboat that once belonged to his father. The musical numbers were slighter than those in Blue Hawaii, and Elvis was humiliated by having to sing to a crustacean, Song of the Shrimp, and warble about the joys of ocean fishing. We're coming in loaded. He channeled his discontent through karate, breaking as many as 40 boards a day in his hotel suite until Wallace stopped him, fearing the star would injure his hand. For Elvis, the film's saving grace was the obvious hit Return to Sender, which soared to number 2 and stayed on the charts for 14 weeks, following on the heels of several other huge records, Can't Help Falling in Love, Good Luck Charm, and Marie's the Name, his latest flame. Yet one more song, The Walls Have Ears, a dance number with co-star Laurel Goodwin, became a private joke with Elvis and the guys. He dressed in the black trousers made for the scene, Joe wrote in his autobiography, without putting on underwear. Elvis rarely used underwear. "Hey, Joe, these pants don't feel right," he told him. "They're rubbing me the wrong way." The dance scene was complicated, Joe continued. The apartment was rigged for special effects, including a coffee table that bounced around the floor, and a ceiling that crashed down a few seconds after Elvis and Laurel jumped backward, out of the way and onto a floor model record console. At some point during all the wiggling and jumping, Little Elvis, as he called it, became erect. Director Taurog didn't notice, and when Elvis came off the set, he walked straight to the nearest chair and sat down. "Did you see that?" he whispered to Joe. "I couldn't stop the feeling. Geez, I hope they don't have to reshoot this. The ceiling might get me this time." Of course, Joe told all the guys, who teased Elvis mercilessly. When he went to the dailies, Elvis nearly leapt from his seat. "Hot damn," he said. "Will you look at that?" There was no mistaking the Woody, which was not only obvious, but prominent. Joe tried to quell his fears, saying the studio would probably cut it out in the editing. "Man, I hope they don't see it and decide to cut it off before we get out of here," Elvis cracked. But when the film was released, there was little Elvis rising to attention and aimed directly at Laurel Goodwin. On the whole, says Goodwin, whose character vied against Stella Stevens for his affection, Elvis did not like this film. Once he commented to me, "One thing about working with Wallace is that he spends a lot of money on the production, the accommodations, the catering, because he has me so cheap. With the money he makes on my movies, he then can afford to go off and do Beckett." Elvis got along well with Laurel, who was Wallace's second choice, replacing Dolores Hart, who had decided to enter the convent. Laurel, who was 19 years old and making her film debut, found Elvis surprisingly sweet and attentive. He told her that he had lost Gladys 4 years before, and truly believed he would one day rejoin his beloved mother. The teen actress spent a lot of time with Elvis and the guys, who all treated me like protective big brothers. However, Elvis seemed to clash with Stella Stevens. On the surface, they should have gotten along, as Stella, a year younger than Elvis, was born in Mississippi, grew up in Memphis, went to Memphis State, and had once worked as a model in the tea room of Goldsmith's department store. But according to Goodwin, she had to be ordered by Hal Wallace, to whom she was under contract, to do the film. Stella concurs that she wasn't keen on making an Elvis Presley picture. "I was looking to work with great actors." And when she read the script, she threw it across the room, calling it dreck. She was miffed to be cast as the girl Elvis dumps, and as the singer herself, ticked that Marnie Nixon dubbed her voice in the nightclub scenes. She never saw the film, she asserts, and never will. "I was thought of as the bad girl, while Elvis was crazy about little girls and white cotton panties," Stella has said. They never dated, because when Red West called her to see if she wanted to hang out, she thought Elvis should have called her himself. They were just a group of boys having fun, but I was a grown woman by then, or life had made me one, says the actress, who married at 15, had a child at 16, and divorced at 17. I had nothing against Elvis. I thought he was greatly talented. But the two clashed on his professional standards. I said, "Why do you do pictures like this instead of seeking out the best directors in the business?" He said, "Why knock success?" I wasn't knocking it. I was saying there are no limits to the work you could do, rather than these singin' and a lovin' and a fightin' films. The longer she talked, though, the more he disliked me. In recent years, when a fan approached her for an autograph and asked what it was like working with Elvis, Stevens reportedly said she couldn't stand him, and that when they were alone together, he forced himself on her, and she had to fight him off. Whether that was true, more and more, the angry Elvis used physical force with women, including Anita. In early 1962, she was out in California at the Bellagio Roadhouse when Elvis was making Girls, Girls, Girls. She stayed home from the studio one day and went into the library outside Elvis's bedroom and picked out a book. There, pressed inside, she found a letter. I saw it was from Priscilla. She stood reading it, just as Priscilla had read Anita's letters in Germany. I remember it said something to the effect of, "Please call my daddy," and, "If you call my daddy, I know he'll let me come over there. I want to come over there so bad," like young girls talk. It took her breath away. Elvis had said, "She's a friend, she means nothing, she's a fan." She faced him with it as soon as he got home. I said, "What is this letter? Who is this Priscilla? You said she was just a child." I was just furious, and he was furious too because I had found it. Oh, he was so upset. He grabbed me and threw me up against the closet. I said, "You're telling stories, and everything you said was a lie." I packed my bags and came back home that night to Graceland, to Grandma. When she walked in the house, the phone was ringing. She didn't want to talk to him, but he kept calling. I remember when he got me on the phone, he said, "Little, please don't tell anybody about this. This girl, again, she's just a child. She's just a 14-year-old child. It means absolutely nothing. She just wants to visit. And if you told anybody, I'd get in a lot of trouble. She's so young." He just begged me, "Little, little, little." I just couldn't imagine coming over to the United States. It didn't sound right to me. But I said, "I won't tell anybody." And I never did. I never did tell anybody. 22. A Little Happiness. By the time Priscilla arrived for a 2-week visit on June 17, 1962, she was no longer a 14-year-old girl. Elvis may have still thought of her that way, and even preferred for her to remain 14, which could be why he referenced her as that age in his argument with Anita. But in truth, Priscilla had celebrated her 17th birthday 3 weeks earlier, and she was a far more experienced girl than the one who had stood at the air base in Germany and waved goodbye to her soldier boyfriend. But she was also more insecure about her place in his life. When she saw him on the big screen kissing such glamorous movie stars as Juliette Prowse, Tuesday Weld, and Joan Blackman, she wondered how she could ever measure up to such women. She was a schoolgirl in Germany. For 2 torturous years, as she would put it, Elvis maintained only sporadic contact. Every day she waited for the mail, and every night she listened for the phone. He wasn't much of a letter writer, but he sent her records with clues in the song titles. "I'll Take Care of You," "Soldier Boy," "It's Now or Never," "Fever." "When I didn't hear from him, I was heartbroken," she has written. "When I did, I was ecstatic." On the telephone, he assured her he still loved her, and no, he wasn't going with Nancy Sinatra or any of those actresses she had read about in Photoplay magazine. He hadn't called for the past month because he was making a movie. It didn't mean anything. But her fear, or possibly her mother's fear, that he had lost interest in her spurred Priscilla to write the letter begging Elvis to bring her to the States. She didn't know what was going on or what to do. And neither did her parents, who must have weighed the predicament of whether it was better to have Priscilla consorting with reckless boys in Germany or with an international playboy 10 years her senior. Finally, Elvis said he would work out the arrangements with her stepfather and send her a first-class round-trip ticket to Los Angeles. When Elvis wanted something with utter passion, Priscilla says, he could convince anyone of anything. Now he went to work on both of Priscilla's parents, speaking with them at length. He wired Captain Beaulieu a detailed itinerary of where Priscilla would be every minute of her 2-week trip. He also promised she would have round-the-clock chaperones, either Vernon and Dee or George and Shirley Barris, who would open their Griffith Park home to her. The captain, so rigid and harsh at home that even his own family was afraid of him, said yes. The reason, offers Joe Esposito, is not because Priscilla's parents promoted this relationship more than Priscilla, as some suggest, but because they knew that the two of them were in love, and Elvis loved the military. He was a very patriotic guy, and he had a lot of respect for the captain, and the captain could tell that. So that made him feel good, too. When the arrangements were in place, Elvis spoke with Patty and the other girls who regularly partied at the house. "I want you to know something," he said, sounding serious. "I met this girl in Germany, and we've been talking on the phone a lot. I'm bringing her here." But during Priscilla's visit, the house would be family-oriented. The guys who were married, including Joe, would bring their wives over each night, and the parties would temporarily stop. Still, there was the problem of Anita. Elvis always spent the 4th of July in Memphis, but the holiday fell during Priscilla's trip to the States. So Joni Esposito, Joe's wife, who was pregnant with their daughter, Debbie, was assigned the task of keeping Anita occupied. If Joni went to Memphis, Elvis figured, Anita would think he and the guys weren't far behind. He could deal with the fallout later. When Joe picked Priscilla up at LAX that summer day, he found a nervous teenager who had no idea what to expect. He gave her a short tour of Los Angeles, taking her by the film studios where Elvis made his movies, and then speeding along Sunset Strip to the wrought iron gates of Bel Air and on to the mansion on Bellagio Road. In Joe's memory, she pretty well didn't say too much. Whatever Elvis said was right, and she did it. Remember, Priscilla was young, naive, and shy, didn't know too much about the world, and was in awe of Elvis and of the life he was leading. Indeed, even the airport seemed beautiful to her after the drabness of Germany, and when Elvis's butler Jimmy met her at the door, Mr. P is in the den, Priscilla could hardly believe such opulence. Joe led her downstairs where she heard loud music and people laughing, and then she saw him, leaning over the pool table, ready to make a shot. His face lit up, and in dark trousers, a white shirt, a dark captain's hat on his newly black hair, he looked thinner and even more breathtaking than ever. "There she is," he shouted and threw down the pool stick. "There's Priscilla." He picked her up and kissed her, and then gave her a wide smile. "Let me look at you," he said. "You're all grown up." She was embarrassed that everyone was watching. Patty Perry saw fear in her eyes, and she hoped when Elvis looked her up and down that he hadn't noticed the 5 pounds she'd gained, or that he didn't think her ponytail made her seem too much like a little girl. But he did seem overjoyed to see her, even if he went right back to his pool game. He was different, though, than he'd been in Germany, mischievous and cocky with a quick temper. When a girl warned him to look out for a glass teetering near the edge of the pool table, he shot her a nasty look, as if to say she should have taken care of it herself. And a few days later, when he played Priscilla some of his new songs and asked her what she thought, he flipped out when she told him she loved his voice, but she preferred the raw rock and roll to his new brand of polished pop. "I didn't ask you what style I should be singing," he charged. "I just asked about these songs." Then he called her an amateur and stormed out of the room, slamming the door. His moods would continue to be erratic, but she knew his true nature was kind, generous, and romantic. That night, he sent her alone to his bedroom. "Up the stairs, the first door to your right," he whispered to her. "The lights are on. I'll be right up." They would go separately, so it wouldn't seem so obvious. Upstairs, she gazed at the luxurious carpets and furnishings, and then at his king-size bed. I immediately thought of how many women might have slept there, whose bodies he had embraced and fondled, and even worse, whose lips had passionately pressed his and driven him to ecstasy, she wrote in her autobiography. I couldn't think about it anymore. She took a quick bath and dusted with powder she found in the medicine cabinet, and soon they were lying next to each other. He told her he hadn't been able to get her out of his mind since Germany, that she had been the one thing that kept him going. Their kissing was passionate and intense, and as they began to explore each other, he discovered that I was still as untouched as he'd left me 2 years before. But her sex drive was even more powerful. I was ready, she has said. He wasn't. He was glad I had saved myself, but was still committed to my purity. What could I say? What could I do? I wanted him. I know he wanted me. But according to him, the time wasn't right. We'll know when, he said, and had Joe drive her to the Barris's home, where she reluctantly spent the night. However, that was the only night she spent with George and Shirley. After that, she slept in Elvis's bed. And so, as President Bill Clinton would do nearly 35 years later, Elvis and Priscilla parsed the meaning of what constitutes sex, and then lied about it for years, Elvis insisting to the guys, as Priscilla did, that she was a virgin until their wedding night. I believe that with all my heart, Charlie Hodge said. If they did not have full-out sex, it was because Elvis was content with the foreplay he preferred to intercourse. But Elvis would tell one of his last girlfriends, Mindy Miller, that he and Priscilla had, indeed, been sexually involved long before they married, just as Priscilla confided the same to Billy's wife, Jo Smith. Publicly, meanwhile, she continued to perpetuate the myth. The day after Priscilla arrived in Los Angeles, Patty Perry did her hair, in that big boomba, as Patty puts it. She had light hair, too, and we dyed it black. It was Priscilla's idea, Patty says, but the 17-year-old already knew what Elvis liked, or thought she did. At first, he was critical of it and made her cry, but everything got smoothed over. They were leaving the following day for Las Vegas, taking the motorhome and staying at the Sahara Hotel, run by the Colonel's mob friend, Milton Prell. She's a nice girl, Alan Fortis told Elvis. A little young, maybe. Alan didn't want to come right out and say he thought theirs was an inappropriate relationship. That wouldn't have been his style. Instead, he said there were a lot of pretty girls who were legal age. But Elvis insisted that 17-year-old girls were a lot more advanced than 17-year-old boys. Yeah, Alan said, but they're still jailbait. In Las Vegas, Elvis took the first steps in grooming Priscilla to be his perfect wife. He bought her 6 gowns and matching shoes, in part to make her look older so she could accompany him to adult clubs, and then took her to the famous Susie Cream Cheese Boutique for wilder clothes. Finally, to complete her new look, he asked Armand, a hotel hairdresser, to come to the suite. The cosmetologist then spent 2 hours teasing and twisting up her hair with one long curl falling at her left shoulder. Then he went to work on her makeup, applying the kohl, mascara, and eyeliner so heavily that no one could have been able to tell if my eyes were black, blue, or black and blue. When he finished, Priscilla had the classic, exaggerated cat-eye makeup that defined the extreme 1960s Vegas style, replete with 2 pairs of false eyelashes. That was what Elvis wanted, she wrote. When I put on my brand new brocade gown, my transformation to a sophisticated siren was complete. I looked like one of the lead dancers in the Folies Bergère. More specifically, she looked exactly like Elvis's stripper friend, Tura Satana. God damn, what happened to little Scylla, said Elvis, who had darkened his own eyelashes. You look beautiful. Sure doesn't look like the same girl we met in Germany wearing a sailor dress, Joe said. She had changed in other ways, too. In Germany, Priscilla had only saved the pills Elvis offered her to stay awake during school. But now she took amphetamines and sleeping pills right along with him to keep up with his hours. She liked the feeling. The pills melted away her inhibitions and put her more in sync with Elvis in every way. but she was moving in a world she didn't know and couldn't handle without the drugs. And deep down, she was scared and confused, loaded with lurking anxiety. The night before she went back home to Germany, Elvis told her he would see about bringing her to Graceland for Christmas, and their lovemaking reached new heights, even if Priscilla was coy in describing it. Elvis wasn't going to let me go home without my taking a little of him with me, she wrote. He didn't enter me. He didn't have to. He fulfilled my every desire. When she stepped off the plane in Germany, Priscilla's parents could hardly believe their eyes. She had left 2 weeks earlier in a white cotton suit and nothing more than a touch of mascara, but she came home in a tight black dress with her hair in an architectural monstrosity. Her mother remembers that she obviously had been crying. Her eyeliner was running, her eyes were red. She looked lost and terribly sad. Captain Beaulieu was more blunt. Her eyes looked like 2 piss holes in the snow. When Priscilla asked to go to the ladies' room to wipe her face, her father yanked her up. "You're going straight home," he barked. "If you left it on this long, you might as well keep it on another hour." He barely said another word to her until they got home. For a girl whose self-worth had been tied to her physical appearance since she was a child competing in beauty contests, it was devastating. Now, Elvis, too, was in deep, and he faced his toughest Christmas since the year he brought Dottie Harmony to town. If he convinced Captain Beaulieu to let Priscilla return for the holidays, he was going to have to break things off with Anita. There was no way he would not be at Graceland for Christmas, and if he were in Memphis with Priscilla, there was no way that Anita wouldn't know. Anita would expect to spend Christmas with him herself. It was a tough choice, in Joe Esposito's estimation. Anita is a great lady. But Priscilla looked like Gladys, and Anita didn't. In fact, every time he looked at Anita, he was reminded of how he'd disappointed Gladys in not marrying her. Anita was also older and might resume her career at any time. If Elvis were to marry, he wanted a traditional wife who stayed home and cared for the house and family. He pretty well raised Priscilla to be that way, says Joe. He fell out of love with Anita because he started dating Priscilla. On July 10th, 1962, Elvis returned to Memphis and resumed his usual activities, playing touch football, renting out the Memphian, and 3 or 4 nights a week, watching the night turn to dawn on the rides at the fairgrounds. As before, Anita was his date, but he knew not to mention Priscilla to her. She'd found out that Priscilla had visited him in L.A., and she knew the teenager was in his life. But Anita convinced herself that Priscilla's youth ruled her out as serious competition, and clung to the notion that there were certain kinds of girls that Elvis spent time with, but others he reserved for marriage. Besides, they'd been together 5 years. It was a real relationship, not some little infatuation. Then, one evening, Anita was coming down the back stairs at Graceland when she heard Elvis, Alan, and Lamar talking in the kitchen, sitting around the breakfast bar. As she neared the door, I heard Elvis say something like, "Well, I'm just having a really hard time making up my mind between the two." And of course, I stopped. I knew exactly what he was talking about. Back then, girls had pride, and I was very prideful, so I just marched my little self down the stairs. They went into the dining room to have their evening meal, breakfast for Elvis, and sat down at the table with Vernon. "I heard what you just said," she announced, her voice shaky with anger, "and I'm going to make it real easy for you. You're not going to have to make that choice because I'm going to leave." She had hot tears in her eyes, and she got up and called her brother Andy to come get her. Elvis followed her and put his hands on her shoulders and said, "I hope to God I'm doing the right thing in letting you go." Anita shook him off. She was too hurt for a conversation like that, even though it had been the most difficult decision she'd ever made. "You can't keep me from going," she snapped. "I'm going." Then she calmed down and simply said, "It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference." They walked back into the dining room, and Elvis became very upset, and Mr. Presley began to cry too. Nobody could eat a bite, and then Vernon said, "Well, if you must leave, Anita, maybe you'll meet again. There are people who sometimes separate and get back together. You'll get back together again." Anita shook her head. "I don't know. I'm not planning on it." Then she left to go upstairs and pack her things. When she came down, Elvis thought about how she had stopped working to be with him, and then shoved some money down in her purse. But even that angered her. "No," she yelled. "I don't want any money." She took it out, and then she left. It was very hard, but I never went back again as his girlfriend. She moved home to Jackson, Tennessee for a while, and later began working for the Memphis City Commissioner. Then one day Elvis showed up at her office. He caught me in the hall up there, and I could never get away from him. He had me cornered, talking to me. My goodness, my knees got weak because I still cared, but I'd made up my mind that it was over. At the end of August 1962, Elvis began work on It Happened at the World's Fair, his 12th film, and his first in a 4-picture deal with MGM. Norman Taurog would again direct. The light musical comedy co-starred Joan O'Brien as Elvis's love interest and was set in Seattle against the real-time backdrop of the 1962 exposition. Elvis plays a crop duster in money straits. His partner, Gary Lockwood, gambled away their money, and the sheriff has attached a lien to their plane. It Happened at the World's Fair is memorable for both the number 11 hit, One Broken Heart for Sale, and Elvis's sartorial splendor. Hollywood tailor Cy DeVore dressed him in conservative suits and ties to make him look like a smart, well-dressed young businessman, according to producer Ted Richmond. Thus, Elvis's metamorphosis from rebellious rock and roller to handsome leading man was complete. It Happened at the World's Fair is also the only picture on which Elvis had the Memphis Mafia dress in actual uniforms, black short-sleeved tunics over white shirts with black pants. It gave them all a slight garage mechanic look, but for Elvis, it was just like being back in the army. Each of his troops had his name festooned across his breast pocket: Joe, Alan, Billy. The only difference was that now Elvis was the general, in total power, and in complete control of his black-suited brigade. Research on twinless twins, such as Elvis, has shown an odd, yet consistent and inherent fascination with uniformity. They commonly talk about being powerfully drawn to groups of individuals dressed alike. The semblance of everyone appearing, if not being, the same, identical, twinned, is at the base of their motivation and intrigue. It gives them a sense of solace and reinforces the notion that they are not alone, a feeling Elvis wrestled with to the extreme once his mother passed away. While seldom publicly reported, says psychologist Whitmer, the need for uniformity underscores the difficulty any twinless twin has in communicating to others with a different personal history the strange world in which he finds himself trapped. The cast of It Happened at the World's Fair included 2 young actors who would go on to distinguish themselves: Kurt Russell, playing a bit part as a bratty child who kicks Elvis in the shin, and would later portray Elvis in a television film, and TV's future Batgirl, Yvonne Craig, who had a secondary role. It was not a good film. I had a small part, and it was a dance number, although I didn't dance. My sister and I went to the drive-in movie to see it, and I didn't want to stay for the rest of it. I just wanted to see how I looked with short hair. After my scene was over, I would like to have left, but I thought, God, that's really egocentric. So I sat there bored witless, and my sister did too. Finally, she said, "Would you mind terribly if we went?" I said, No, I'd love it. I was sitting there dying. Elvis romanced 3 of the actresses on the film, including the blonde O'Brien, a former country singer who had made the jump to acting and was just finalizing her divorce, and brunette Sandra Giles, whose name appeared near the end of the credits. She was amused when she met Elvis on the set. He said to one of his men, "Would you get up and give Miss Giles your chair?" But usually the man gets up and gives you his chair. They went out to a steak restaurant in a place where you had to know the owner to get in, and just sat and talked. We had a few dates, and he was very nice. He wasn't pushy. He didn't even try to make out. Elvis was equally genteel with Yvonne Craig, who was impressed at how he interacted with the women on the film. Just as he knew what his female fans expected, he also knew that all of the women in the cast needed his attention. It wasn't predatory at all, or it didn't seem so to me. It was more of a Southern gentleman thing. He would spend 5 minutes with each of the girls on the set, one at a time. It was really sweet to see, and it was like having 14 brothers with the guys. They were all around, lighting your cigarette and asking if you would like another Pepsi. Yvonne wondered if Elvis was going to ask her out. She could feel a sort of latent heat between them. And finally, he made his move. During shooting, Joe called and made his smooth approach. "Elvis wanted me to ask if you would be free for dinner." Yvonne was dating someone else at the time, but not exclusively, and so she accepted. In an unusual move, Elvis accompanied Gene Smith and Richard Davis, a new member of the group, to pick her up, mostly because he wanted to show off his gold-dusted Cadillac. George Barris had recently customized it, repainting the black exterior in white Murano pearl and finishing the interior with solid gold, as Barris liked to say, meaning everything was gold-plated and stamped with a golden guitar insignia. The effect was something between a rock and roll chariot and a pimpmobile. Richard knocked at Yvonne's door and told her that Elvis was waiting in the car. I lived in an apartment that was like a cell block or some other kind of lockup. It was all square and you could look down in the patio and see who was coming and going. And when I saw this car, I said, "Oh my." It was the weirdest thing I had ever seen. Elvis said very apologetically, "I brought this because I thought it might be fun. It's not like I travel like this all the time." It had deep, deep, deep carpeting, so that when you got in, your feet sort of sank in and disappeared. And then he pushed all the buttons for me. It had 2 telephones, one with a direct line to Memphis. It had a complete entertainment center. It had an electric shoeshine machine and a bar filled with Pepsi. He offered me one, which I thought was funny. Oh, it was a crazy-looking thing. When they arrived on Bellagio Road, Jimmy, the butler, served the 2 of them what should have been a romantic dinner. But the house was so baronial and the tables so long and expansive, it probably sat 30 people by Yvonne's estimation, that everything just seemed awkward. I'm thinking, oh my God, if he sits at the end, I'm so nearsighted I'll never see him. So I sat at the head of the table, and he sat next to me. But because he was shy and I was too, there wasn't a lot of conversation. All you could hear was the sound of chewing and forks going. The scene proved livelier when they joined the guys and their dates afterward to watch television. Scatter, the chimp, made an appearance, all dressed up like a person in a little suit and hat. But Yvonne wasn't wearing her glasses. There was this thing that came into the room and someone was holding on to him. And at first, she thought he was one of the boys being silly. She quickly caught on when Scatter started jumping around and misbehaving. He was really obstreperous, this animal. He would pry your mouth open, looking for gum, and he would belly up to the bar and bang his glass, and they would give him hard liquor and he would drink it. Then, when he would get tired of it, he would pour it on the floor. Today, that couldn't happen. Somebody would turn them in for animal abuse, because they shouldn't have been getting this chimp drunk. It's a wonder they didn't kill him. But nobody did anything about it, and this was somebody's rented house with this chimp loose in it. In a little while, Elvis invited Yvonne to his bedroom on the pretense of getting away from Scatter. Soon, there was kissing and hugging and stuff like that, but it wasn't particularly passionate, and there was no sexual relationship at all. At 25, Yvonne was 2 years younger than Elvis, yet she felt protective of him, and already the brunette sensed he liked her because she reminded him of Gladys. And so she launched into what she calls her Mother Craig lecture. I said, "You know, Elvis, it's fine that you brought me here, but this is a dangerous move for you. You're just lucky I'm the way I am because you have no idea. You should be very careful who you bring here, because you're in Hollywood now, and it's a terrible trap. If you take a girl alone back here in your quarters, she can say anything happened. Cry rape, scream, carry on, and the courts will say you did it. There will be horrible publicity, and you'll be in a lot of trouble. Do you do this often? I'm worried about you." And I'm telling you, he sat there saying, Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am." On the way home, she suddenly became overwhelmed with embarrassment. After all, he'd been in the business for years and knew all the pitfalls. But it did occur to me that he needed talking to. He had such innocence that I thought, oh my God, I don't want anything bad to happen to him. And he did encourage this sort of motherly interest in him. Besides, I had seen some of the women the henchmen had in the house, and I thought, I know where they picked up those girls, and I know what they have on their minds, too. However, before she left that night, Yvonne and Elvis found common ground. She mentioned that when she was a teenager, before ballet dancing led to acting, she thought about going to medical school. She'd had her Grey's Anatomy and Cecil Loeb since she was 16, she said, and to her surprise, he dragged out medical books and started showing me. Scooting close to her, Elvis paged through his physician's desk reference. "Do you have any pills in your house that you can't identify?" "I don't think so," she said. "Well, if you do, this book will tell you what every one of them is." I thought he was interested in medicine, but now I think he was interested in what you can take to keep yourself skinny and what you can take that won't be contraindicated with another drug and kill you. Elvis was indeed studying to see what kinds of pills he could take and in what quantity to keep thin, stay up all night, and then rest enough to be bright-eyed on the set. Even so, he made some near-fatal errors. According to Alan Fortas's memoir, Elvis, From Memphis to Hollywood, one occurred that November 1962 on the drive home in the motorhome. Elvis and the guys had gone to Las Vegas when filming wrapped on It Happened at the World's Fair, staying up day and night to catch the shows, including Johnny Ray at the Hacienda. Gene was wired from all the pills he was taking, plus all the extra that Elvis had given him. In fact, he'd been so wired for 3 days and 2 nights on speed that he couldn't sleep. We were in Arizona and it was freezing outside. Elvis was driving the bus, and he gave Gene 500 milligrams of Demerol, a synthetic opiate. Gene took the little white pill and waited to fall asleep. But 45 minutes later, when he was still stoked to the skies, Elvis gave him another hit. An hour went by and Gene was still bouncing off the clouds, trying to fix stuff on the bus, working on things under Elvis's feet, trying to do everything. He was so out of it. Finally, Elvis told him, "Look, Gene, go back in my bedroom, man, and get some sleep. Those pills will kick in before long." So Gene went back in the bedroom, and after a while, Elvis told Billy to go check on him. In the meantime, Gene had opened the window, and a terrible draft had blown in on him. So when Billy tried to wake Gene up and couldn't, the stuff had finally hit him. He felt Gene's face, and it was just ice cold. Gene's heartbeat had probably slowed down, and his breathing too. But mostly he was cold from all that air coming in on him. Well, Billy just freaked out. It hadn't been that long since he'd found Junior dead in his bed, and he thought it had happened again. Billy came running back up to the front of the bus, yelling, "Elvis, Elvis, I think Gene's dead." I shouted in his ear, and he didn't move a muscle, and he's cold to the touch. Elvis pulled over to the side of the road real quick, and he had his seatbelt on, and he jumped up so fast the seatbelt almost cut his damn legs off. Of course, we all ran back there, but Gene wasn't dead. He was just cold from the window being open. He wasn't coming around, though, that was true, so we got him out and dragged him along the side of the highway. He was okay. He'd just been up for 3 days, and he had 2 big hits of Demerol in him. It scared the shit out of Elvis, though, he said. "God damn, Gene, I ought to kill your ass." 2 months earlier, while on the film set, Elvis gave an interview to Lloyd Shearer of Parade magazine, in which he mentioned that he often read medical texts and would have liked to become a doctor. He also talked about how males seemed to dislike him when he started out, but that his stint in the army changed that, along with the fact that there's never anything about my thinking that I'm a lover or a ladies' man. I've never looked at or thought of myself as being a lady killer or anything like that, and I've never shown it that I know of. Finally, he talked about friends, saying it was important to surround yourself with people who can give you a little happiness. Elvis thought he'd found more than that with Priscilla, who was coming for Christmas after all, even though the Beaulieus had never been apart for the holidays. At first I said no, Anne Beaulieu remembers, But when I saw how much it meant to her, I finally convinced my husband. It wasn't easy. Vernon and Dee, who now had a home of their own near Graceland, flew to New York's Idlewild Airport to meet the passenger flying under the name of Priscilla Fisher. They accompanied her to Memphis, and then Elvis asked her to wait at his father's house on Hermitage Road. "I want to drive her through the gates," he said. "I want to see her face when she sees Graceland for the first time." He had decorated the grounds with a life-size nativity scene and Santa's prancing reindeer, edging the walkways in blue lights for his song, Blue Christmas. When we drove through those gates and I saw the Christmas lights and glittering decorations on those long white columns, Priscilla later said, I thought I was living inside a dream. Except the dream had come true. I had come home with Elvis. 23. Nungin, Thumper, and Bug. The first time I saw Priscilla, remembered Elvis's cousin, Patsy Presley. She looked like a little doll. She was exquisite. She was standing in the stairwell, and Elvis came out of my grandmother's room. He was so proud of Priscilla. His eyes were filled with love. He had just told Vernon's mother she was there. "Come on," Elvis said to Priscilla, taking her hand. "Someone's waiting to see you." Then he led her in to Minnie May, who sat in a chair, a yellow crocheted throw on her lap. She wore dark glasses to keep out the light. Priscilla hadn't seen her since Germany, and the old lady hugged her and asked her to sit down and chat. She had a lot to talk about, especially Elvis's dislike of Dee Presley. The more she talked, the more she dipped her snuff, and pretty soon she was telling Priscilla to call her Dodger, as Elvis did. "I feel like I can confide in you," Priscilla said. "You can, young'un," Grandma soothed. "You're family now." The teenager had brought along little gifts for everyone that Christmas, especially Elvis, to whom she gave an ornate 3-tiered wooden box for his cigarillos. In return, Elvis gave her a diamond ring and a puppy, which she named Honey. But he also gave her something else, 2 500-milligram Placidils, since she was jet-lagged from her trip across the ocean and hadn't slept, trying to keep up with Elvis. "These pills will relax you," he told her. 2 days later, she was still out. It scared the hell out of Vernon and Grandma, remembered Billy Smith, who thought Elvis would have learned his lesson from Jean's episode in the motorhome. They wanted to get a doctor in there, but Elvis said no. He'd just walk her around. But that didn't do any good either. She finally woke up on her own. Priscilla opened her eyes to see Grandma standing over her, her craggy features bent into a frown. Then Minnie May breathed a sigh of relief and chastised her grandson for over-medicating his guest. "How long have I been asleep?" Priscilla asked. Elvis told her. 2 days? I've missed Christmas." "Nah," he said. "You haven't missed anything. The fun's just starting." "More and more," Priscilla says. I was getting used to Elvis's notion of fun. On New Year's Eve, he watched her drink 4 double screwdrivers through a straw and never cautioned her that she would be sick in the ladies' room afterward. Most nights, he merely scared her silly, taking her on all his usual thrill-seeking activities, including the killer roller derby parties, which Priscilla found unnerving. Back at Lauderdale Courts, he had climbed the tall sign outside Billy Wardlaw's window to get her attention, and now he showed off for Priscilla at the fairgrounds. He played a trick on her on the roller coaster, getting out at the top when it teetered for a minute, making her think he'd fallen to his death. He just wanted to see her face when the car returned without him. Then he broke into a big laugh and grabbed her and held her. Patsy could tell right off that Elvis acted differently with Priscilla than he did with his other girlfriends. He was less intense and more relaxed. You got the idea she was his one true love. Other of his relatives also saw it. Billy Smith remembers Elvis would say, "Here she comes, isn't she beautiful?" And Ricky Stanley, Elvis's stepbrother, saw how excited Elvis was that she was coming to visit, that he was like a 15-year-old kid with his first crush. It was like prom night. Marty Lacker, who had temporarily left the group to work for WHBQ radio, got another impression when he stopped by the house soon after Priscilla's arrival. Elvis was sitting out on the front steps, which was unusual for him, and he was up early, which was also out of character. We sat and talked for about an hour, and then I said, "Well, I'll see you later, I've got to go." And Elvis said, No, wait a minute, I want to show you something." We talked on for a while, and the front door opened, and out came this girl, all primped up. She had her hair dyed black and in a beehive, and she was made up like a painted doll, with all this mascara and bright eyeshadow. Elvis said, "This is Priscilla, from Germany." I looked at him and smiled, and gave him a nod like, "Yeah, she's really pretty." He showed her off like he was showing off a new car. She was his trophy, his new toy. Barbara Little, George Klein's girlfriend, remembers how nervous Priscilla looked that Christmas, sitting in the kitchen in bobby socks, a kick-pleat skirt, and cardigan sweater. She was filing her nails and trying to mix with a group of adults she didn't know. And, in fact, Priscilla wasn't sure where she fit into Elvis's life. She only knew she was hurt that he flirted with other girls in front of her on their nightly outings. But in a pattern that would continue through their relationship, he always turned it around on her. He'd accuse me. He'd say that I was just jealous. I was inventing things. I was confusing friendliness with flirting. His accusations were made with such skill that I'd wind up apologizing to him. She was ambivalent about his lifestyle, too. All these people were always around, and except for the time they spent in the bedroom, it seemed like Elvis preferred the company of the guys to her. On her last trip over, she'd gotten so bored watching him play touch football that she took off in his limousine and drove around the field just to amuse herself. In truth, the relationship was mind-boggling for both of them, and Elvis wrestled with all kinds of conflicting emotions. Deep down, he yearned for lasting love and respected the institution of marriage. But at the same time, he didn't want to be tied down to one girl. There was also the matter of one of the biggest stars in Hollywood approaching his 28th birthday with an underage girl in his bed. He knew, consciously or not, that he was emotionally still a child, and so the fact that he was involved with a minor didn't feel wrong at all. In fact, it felt right. But then that got confusing too. In his schizophrenic choice of gifts that Christmas, as Suzanne Finstad noted in Child Bride, he defined the relationship as both older lover, Lolita, the diamond ring, and father-daughter, the puppy. All he knew for sure was how right Priscilla looked at Graceland, and how his mother would have claimed her as her own, the way Dodger did. In fact, he thought of his mother all the time he was around Priscilla. He patted her all the time, called her Nungin, youngin in baby talk, and sometimes also Satnin. After she'd been there a few days, Elvis thought he had to have her there all the time. In early January 1963, on the morning she was supposed to go home, he told her he loved her, that he didn't want to let her go. They were sitting in his upstairs office. "You'll finish your senior year in Memphis," he said. "My parents will never agree to that." "I'll talk them into it." "You can't." And he couldn't, at least not yet. So Priscilla flew on back to Frankfurt. The two moaned together on the phone, and he redoubled his efforts to persuade the Beaulieu's to let her move to Memphis. Priscilla, too, worked on her parents, especially on her stepfather. On January 5th, she wrote to Elvis to say, "I've been talking with my dad, and a decision hasn't yet been made. But still, he hasn't said no, so at least I know there's a chance. Like you said, his main concern is my living in a strange place and where I will stay." In mid-January, before he left for Hollywood to start his next film, Fun in Acapulco, Elvis phoned the captain for an extended talk. He understood Priscilla's grades hadn't been that good. She had failed algebra and German, and barely passed English and history, altering her report card to make a D- look like a B- when Elvis was stationed in Germany. Now she was failing English too, but if she came to live in Memphis, he would see to it that she got a first-class education at an all-girls Catholic institution, Immaculate Conception High School, where she would wear a uniform like everyone else, and she would live with his father and his new wife at their house, not at Graceland, so she would be properly chaperoned. I was enormously resistant to the idea of Scylla going to live in Memphis. Paul Beaulieu has gone on the record to say, as far as I was concerned, it just was not going to happen. But once more, Priscilla's mother was the key. You hear about people with magnetic personalities, and Beaulieu has said. No matter how strongly you might oppose his position, he would charm you over to his side. He did it by being persistent, and also, to a large degree, by being sweet. And so, little by little, Paul Beaulieu began to think seriously about Elvis's offer. Elvis pledged to care for her with absolute devotion. The intimation was that one day they'd marry. In March, Captain Beaulieu and Priscilla flew to Los Angeles, where Elvis was still working on Fun in Acapulco. They stayed at the Bel Air Sands Motel, and Elvis picked them up every day in his Rolls-Royce, or the far more ostentatious, solid gold Cadillac, and took them sightseeing, driving from one end of Los Angeles to another, the Hollywood Hills, Sunset Boulevard, and the Pacific Coast Highway. Captain Beaulieu was impressed, and in between the touring and the studio visits, the two men continued to discuss Priscilla's education and living quarters if she were to move to Memphis. Paul Beaulieu was a military man, but he was also a businessman. He had earned a degree in business administration in Texas, and he had pointed questions about precisely how Elvis saw the financial arrangements. But Elvis had all the answers, and before the captain got on a plane back to Germany, he took Priscilla to Memphis, where he delivered her over to Vernon's care. I kissed my father goodbye and thanked him for trusting me and Elvis, Priscilla wrote. It was now out of my hands. My new life had begun. At the time, only 5 years after Jerry Lee Lewis had created a scandal by marrying his 13-year-old cousin, the arrangement was so unorthodox and threatening to Elvis's career that he would lie about it to the local press. That spring, he told a reporter from the Commercial Appeal who spotted Elvis and Priscilla together in Chenault's parking lot that she was the daughter of a military officer who sent her ahead because she wanted to graduate on time. He also implied that her family was not far behind. Yet Priscilla's stepfather seemed completely nonchalant about discussing the arrangement with others. Philip Barber, who had gotten to know Elvis on Audubon Drive in 1956 during Natalie Wood's visit, was in the Air Force by 1965 and had a staff officer's job in operations plans at Travis Air Force Base near Sacramento, California. One day, he was in casual conversation with a newly minted major named Joseph Paul Beaulieu. My boss called him Joe, whom he saw and talked with almost daily. Major Beaulieu reviewed war plans for active duty units engaged in flying missions in and out of Southeast Asia, as well as contingency plans posed by the intelligence community. The major noted Philip's southern accent. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Well, I came into the Air Force from Memphis, Tennessee." "Oh," Major Beaulieu said, "my daughter lives there." "Really? What does she do there?" "She just got out of school." "Memphis State?" Philip asked. "No, Immaculate Conception." Philip recognized the Catholic girls' school. "Do you have relatives there?" "No, she lives with Elvis Presley." At first, Philip didn't know what to say. "Oh," he finally managed. "She lived with him in high school?" "Yes, Well, are they going to get married?" "Oh, yes, that's been arranged for several years now." But was a perceived promise of marriage really all that it took to get Priscilla to Memphis? Many people think no, that in essence, Elvis bought Priscilla, or that her parents sold her into marriage. Whatever the arrangement, once Priscilla's parents and Elvis came to some understanding, it was as if Priscilla herself had no say in it. She was infatuated with him, yes, but just before she came to Graceland to live with him, she had major misgivings about the move. My feelings were mixed, grateful and glad that Elvis had pulled off this coup, hopeful and determined that our relationship would last, she has written. But her friends back in Germany have a different view. When it came right down to it, they say, she didn't want to go. She preferred staying in Germany with her boyfriend Jamie Lindbergh, with whom she was intimately involved. In fact, her mother was afraid Priscilla would throw Elvis over for Jamie, and his own impression, he told Suzanne Finstad for Child Bride, supports that. Her mom more or less said, "You are going." It was a terribly difficult position for her to be in, sympathizes biographer Finstad. She was conflicted because she had her own relationships that were deceptive to Elvis, so she was just in a quagmire. But throughout her childhood, Priscilla had always been compliant and dutiful in terms of her parents' requests of her, and since she was extremely tied to her mother, the only thing for her to do was to go through with it. If it didn't work out, she could always come home. When her friends in Germany found out, they were aghast, not only that her parents permitted it, but also that she had simply disappeared that March without telling anybody goodbye. The timing of it had been odd, too. Captain Beaulieu had to get special military leave to come to the States, and Elvis was making a movie that March and couldn't go home to Memphis. Why hadn't Priscilla just finished out her school year and moved after turning 18 that May? Colonel Eugene de Saulnier, Paul Beaulieu's friend, neighbor, and fellow officer at Travis Air Force Base, explains the story as he heard it. In that era, it was a very strange thing that somebody would allow that, but it was a situation where she was going to hightail it out of there one way or the other. And from a family point of view, he wanted to make it look like, all right, if that's really what you want to do, then we will support you. I'll take you there. So he went and made the deal with the Presleys to finish her education, and he and Priscilla made their own deal between them, and away they went. If they had announced that she was leaving, the whole place would have been in an uproar with all the publicity. He just snuck her out and took her, and it was all done before anybody really knew. In Los Angeles, meanwhile, Elvis resumed his old way of life. He had moved back into the house on Perugia Way. The Bellagio Roadhouse was a little too fancy for him, said Alan Fortis, and his nightly parties went on as before. He intended to give up nothing to keep Priscilla. She was merely an add-on. One of his frequent guests on Perugia Way was singer-songwriter Jackie DeShannon. The pretty blonde was then still a teenager, but already teetering on the edge of fame as both an artist and a writer. Put a little love in your heart, needles and pins. And soon she would become an important figure in the evolution of folk rock. She often came to Perugia Way with her friend Sharon Sheely, her sometime collaborator, who had been showing up at Elvis's parties with her sister, Mary Jo, since the Knickerbocker days. They sat with Elvis and listened to records, sometimes jamming with their guitars and singing. Jackie and Elvis became good friends. He loved her soulful singing and her laid-back Southern personality. She was born in Kentucky, and he appreciated her talent and saw that she was going places. Sometimes he offered her career advice, and in some ways, he considered himself a mentor to her. Before she first went up to the house, Elvis told her he was going to send one of the guys to pick her up. She was living at home then, and she realized that wasn't going to work. I come from a background where no matter who you are, you come to the door and you say, "Is Jackie home?" But Elvis persisted. He would call and track me down and say, "Come on up, we're going to sing tonight." And I would say, "Elvis, I can't come. My mother will not have it." This went on for several months, and so finally, I came home from ballet class one night, and there was Elvis talking to my mother with a huge pink dog, bigger than I was. From then on, my mother didn't care how I got there. Actress Terry Garr, who danced in 9 of Elvis's movies, was also a familiar face around the Perugia Way house starting at age 16. She remembers going to a party there with her friend Carrie. No chips, no dips, just Elvis, his boys, and a couple of girls sitting around. Soon, Elvis and Carrie began flirting, and eventually they disappeared into Elvis's bedroom. "I was usually such a Girl Scout," Terry wrote in her autobiography, Speed Bumps, Flooring It Through Hollywood. Just so you know, she swore they didn't do it. Knowing Carrie, it's the truth. One woman Elvis was not about to romance was Ursula Andress, his leading lady on Fun in Acapulco. 1, she was married to actor, producer, director John Derek, and 2, the Swiss-born sex goddess intimidated him. He was uncomfortable in their romantic scenes, believing that her shoulders were broader than his and made him look weak. "I was embarrassed to take my damn shirt off next to her," he told Alan, laughing. Later, he elaborated to Mindy Miller. He didn't think she was pretty. She had this big, broad back. He masked it well, though. The only way I knew Elvis was from television, Ursula later said. Here was this new idol, this hip-swinging lover with a guitar. I said, oh my God. And the first day I went to work, here comes over this humble man, full of charm, love in his eyes, and kind and considerate and warm. I was so surprised. She liked him well enough to drop by on another picture later in the year, and according to Sonny West, to pester him, always asking for Alan as a way to get around Priscilla. She went after him. She wanted him bad, and Elvis told us never to leave him alone with her. Fun in Acapulco, another tame Hal Wallace musical, marked a new low in Elvis's career. He sometimes referred to his films as travelogues, but this time he didn't even get to travel, since the Colonel refused to let him go on location. In 1958, a rumor had circulated that Elvis found Mexican women unattractive, and Parker was afraid that someone might try to harm him. We had to do all kinds of trick shots, says screenwriter Alan Weiss. A lot of it is background projection. We all knew that making money was the basic thing, but at the same time we wanted to preserve a little bit of his dignity. All background settings were shot without him, including the breathtaking 136-foot dive off the cliffs of La Quebrada. For that, Elvis modeled his swim trunks, mounted 2 stairs to a platform on the set, and with his arms rigidly fixed in a diver's pose, stared resolutely down at the floor. It might as well have been an abyss of self-loathing. Fun in Acapulco was, as journalist Chet Flippo has noted, another of the worthless movies that obviously began to drain his self-confidence. RCA publicist Ann Fulcino, concerned about Elvis's spirits and the quality of the music of the soundtracks, Bossa Nova Baby would be the film's only notable song, visited him on the set. That kid was not only unhappy, he was ashamed for me to see him prostituting himself with those crummy pictures, she recalled. She took him aside and advised him to take better control of his career, citing Colonel Parker's non-guidance and practically drawing him a diagram on how you build a star. Elvis promised Fulcino he would speak with the Colonel about finding both better scripts and songs. He knew Parker was not the right manager for him. The way the Colonel wanted him to go was not the way Elvis wanted to go. But Elvis seemed paralyzed to make the kinds of changes Fulcino told him were necessary to revitalize his standing in the music world. When Elvis received his release from the picture in late March, he hurried home to Priscilla, who felt isolated, lost, and awkward, making no real friends at school, and knowing only Grandma, Vernon, Dee, and Patsy in the entire town. Though Vernon was tight in doling out spending money, $35 every 2 weeks, sometimes she went shopping at nearby Southland Mall, where her frightening vampire look drew stares. Jackie Carter, who lived in Whitehaven, remembers seeing her there. She had jet black hair that was all back-combed, heavy eye makeup, and white lipstick. She was very quiet and shy. Over the next few weeks, Elvis bought Priscilla a red Corvair as an early graduation present so she could drive herself to school. She was embarrassed at Vernon's chauffeuring her every day. And $1,400 worth of clothing at Laclede's on Union Avenue. He encouraged her shopping habit. It gave her something to do while he was off making movies. Elvis expected her to be totally loyal, says Billy Smith. He thought, I'm in California and I can fool around and it won't mean anything because it's going to be over and done with. But when I get back home, I know I'll have somebody there. He had that old Southern belief. A woman's place is in the home. Several years ago, Suzanne Perry, manager of Tura Satana, Kitten Natividad, and other stars of Russ Myers's sex and violence porn films, sat around a table with author Pamela Des Barres, who was writing a book about rock stars and groupies. A number of the Russ Meyer girls were there, and predictably, they played the Who Have You Slept With game. The names came fast and furiously. Somebody said Jim Morrison, Suzanne remembers, and somebody else said Elvis, and practically everybody at the table went, oh, I slept with Elvis. It was just the funniest thing ever. He did not want me in Hollywood, Priscilla admits, But of course, she wanted to be with him wherever he was, and as their separations grew longer and more frequent, their relationship grew strained. She felt as if she were living a double life, not unlike the way she lived after she met him in Bad Nauheim. I was a prim and proper schoolgirl by day and Elvis's girlfriend by night. That meant she stayed up until 5 a.m. to attend all the outings, and then had to be at school by 8:30 a.m. I would average maybe 1.5 hours of sleep to make all the good grades for my father. That was the difficult part. But it was obvious that Elvis, too, compartmentalized his life. Hollywood was there, and Graceland was here, and never the two should meet, as Priscilla has put it. For Elvis, the two worlds represented a balance, or perhaps a perpetual imbalance, between his professional life and his home life. When a movie wrapped, he couldn't wait to get home, but then he felt trapped there and got anxious for his freedom and the companionship of other women. Then there was the matter of explaining just what he was doing with a teenager. And so Priscilla was kept back. When he was home, though, the place lit up, I lit up, and I was willing, even eager, to cater to his every whim. We all were. And so she forgave him for not attending her graduation ceremony, knowing it would cause too much commotion. She also overlooked his constant criticism. If she slumped, he straightened her back. If she had a chip in her nail polish, he pointed it out. He asked her not to eat tuna fish, her favorite food, because he hated the smell. But she despised the way he repeatedly rapped her on the forehead to remind her not to frown or wrinkle her brow. "Pow, I still feel his hand there," she says. "If I looked up, it had to be with my eyes only, so the skin would stay smooth." I was someone he created. I was just a kid, and I was consumed by him. I could never speak my mind. All I desired was not to disappoint him. He stayed in Memphis for several months that spring, and Priscilla insists she still hoped each night would end with Elvis finally making love to me. I was drunk with ecstasy. I wanted him. I became bolder, reaching out to him, totally open and honest in my need. Again, he stalled her, she wrote, and they fought about it. Elvis's compromise was to play sex games, dressing her up in tardy disguises and capturing their fantasies on Polaroid film. She became what she calls his femme fatale. Almost every night she made quick trips to the drugstore to buy more packs of film. She was certain that the clerk knew what they were up to, and Priscilla would blush as she approached the counter, paid, and then hurried back to Graceland. There Elvis would direct her as he might any starlet. She'd wear her schoolgirl uniform to seduce him, or pretend to be a teacher coming on to a student, or a secretary pleasuring herself. Eventually, they worked up to include another girl, a hairdresser Elvis knew, for simulated lesbian sex. And in time, they moved up to videotape. Watching two women together isn't an unusual fantasy for men. There's a purity to it, since nobody but a woman knows what a woman wants. But involving a teenage girl is more than just imposing artifice. It's a bent use of power and control, something akin to slavery or human bondage. It's also a bit sadistic. But Priscilla says she didn't mind doing it. It brought them closer, she thought. I was ready to indulge him any way I could. And that included carrying a small, pearl-handled derringer in her bra, or in a holster around her waist, since Elvis had taken to always carrying a gun under his coat. Before she graduated, she'd sit in class and daydream about how surreal it all was. While my classmates were deciding which colleges to apply to, I was deciding which gun to wear with what sequined dress. I was tempted to say to Sister Adrian, "Oh, by the way, sister, does gunmetal gray go with royal blue sequins?" Almost every night, Elvis gathered a group to go screen movies at the Memphian, renting 3 or 4 and watching them until daybreak. As was his habit, he also let in a few fans who waited outside the doors. One evening, he was surprised to see an old love there. June Juanico was in town for the WIBC, the Women's National Bowling Tournament. Her friends goaded her into stopping by Graceland, the surprise Elvis so wanted to show her 6 years before. The gate guard, most likely one of his uncles, recognized her name, and told her she could find him at the theater that night. Her heart raced as she peered through the glass doors at the Memphian, and she pounded hard on the thick metal in hope someone would let her in. A man came, and she was flabbergasted when he said, "You're June, aren't you? I've seen pictures of you at the house. I'll tell Elvis you're here." June grabbed his arm. "No," she pleaded. "If you don't mind, let me just go surprise him." Elvis was one of the most famous men in the world now, and he lived in a different universe than the one they'd shared in the 1950s. With his streamlined features, tailored clothes, and razor-cut hair, he hardly looked like the same person. It took all the nerve she could muster, but she made her way down the aisle. I went in the row behind him, and I tapped him on the back, and as he turned around and looked at me, our eyes just locked. He got up and put me in a death grip. Joe Esposito ran over because he thought someone was hurting him, but Elvis was holding on to me. Priscilla was sitting next to him, and she just kept her eyes glued to the screen. She was very gracious, but when I got back to my girlfriends, I said, "If y'all want to buy some makeup in Memphis, Tennessee, you ain't gonna find any because Priscilla's got it all on her face." Just after the 4th of July holiday in 1963, Elvis returned to Hollywood to make Viva Las Vegas, his best MGM picture since Jailhouse Rock. The plot revolved around Elvis as Lucky Jackson, a guitar-playing race car driver whose life is upended after meeting Rusty Martin, a swimming instructor with show business aspirations. With the casting of the delicious and dynamic Anne Margaret, Elvis found the first co-star who could match him in looks, musicality, and screen appeal. Together, they were nothing short of electrifying. Viva Las Vegas, directed by George Sidney, would plug two live wires together and make a formula musical sizzle. Yet Elvis would find an even higher voltage connection with the 22-year-old actress off-screen. Anne Margaret Olsen, born in Sweden and reared in suburban Chicago, had just made a splash in her third film, Bye Bye Birdie, a satire about the Elvis phenomenon and the teen mourning that accompanied his entering the armed services. 3 months after its premiere, Sidney, who had directed her in Bye Bye Birdie, introduced her to Elvis on the set of Viva Las Vegas. He believed the meeting would be so momentous that he arranged for a studio photographer to be on hand. "Elvis Presley, I'd like you to meet a wonderful young lady, Anne Margaret," the director said. "Anne Margaret, this is Elvis Presley." Simultaneously, the two stars started to say, "I've heard a lot about you," then stopped in mid-sentence and broke into nervous laughter. They were both dressed like young professionals, she in a white knit double-breasted jacket and A-line skirt, and he in a suit and tie. Their conservative appearance hid the fact that they both shared a devil within, she would later write. "We were quiet, polite, and careful," Anne Margaret remembered in her autobiography, My Story. "But I knew what was going to happen once we got to know each other. Elvis did too. We both felt a current that went straight through us. It would become a force we couldn't control." Anne Margaret was the female Elvis, all beauty, sex, and talent. She spoke in a breathy, morning-after voice that managed to sound real and projected a paradox of Midwestern reserve and raw sensuality. Men would have died for her. On day one, they both realized the relationship would be serious, but whether Elvis knew it immediately, Anne Margaret was the woman he had waited for all his life. He had been deluded into thinking so many girls were his twin soul, but now he was face to face with the one woman who fulfilled that destiny. She felt it too, writing, "It was like discovering a long-lost relative, a soulmate, shy on the outside but unbridled within. In many ways, both of us, despite fame and whatever else we'd achieved so quickly, had remained very childlike and emotionally dependent. We wanted to find that same non-judgmental, unqualified love that our parents gave us. He had touched something deep within my psyche." Just as they said the same exact words when they were introduced, when they began to rehearse their dance routines, they looked at each other and saw virtual mirror images. When Elvis thrust his pelvis, mine slammed forward too. When his shoulder dropped, I was down there with him. When he whirled, I was already on my heel." "It's uncanny," she said. Elvis grinned. "The minute they looked into each other's eyes, they clicked," says Joe Esposito. "There's no two ways about it. You could just feel the energy." Now Elvis asked Joe to find out if Anne Margaret was single. Learning she was, he bypassed his usual approach to courting and picked up the phone himself. "Rusty," he said, using her character's name in the film. "How about going out with me and the guys to see a show?" It was a group date, innocent and friendly, and they were never alone for a second. But the next time he asked her out, he brought her home to Perugia Way, and he told the guys he wanted the house to himself when he got back. Their late-night talks revealed a shared love of motorcycles, music, and performing, along with strong family and religious ties. At first, Anne Margaret told no one but her parents, but soon, says Joe, the secret was out. Everybody on the movie set will tell you that when they were together, it was obvious they loved each other. Soon they were wheeling through LA on their Harleys and pedaling around Bel Air on a bicycle built for double takes. "People honked and we waved," she wrote. It was the worst possible time for Elvis to be falling in love. Only 4 months earlier, he had made promises to a military captain and installed a teenager in his home and in his bed. But neither he nor the kittenish redhead could deny what was happening. "Anne Margaret really was the love of his life," says Patty Perry. "She was just the best girl, and they were like little kids together, laughing and having fun. They spent a lot of time together, and as Lamar remembers, it blew our minds that he went with her alone so much. We would give him a bunch of money, and he'd jump in that Rolls Royce and stay gone. Nobody knew where he was, except that he was with her." Part of the time, he was over visiting her parents at their apartment, an indication of how serious he was about the girl he called Rusty Ammo and Thumper, the code name she would later use when she phoned for him at Graceland. As for what she called him, "When I like someone," she told a magazine, "I say Scoopy. Elvis is Scoopy." The Memphis Mafia, half in love with her themselves, could hardly stand the thoughts of the two of them together. When the film went on location in Las Vegas, Elvis stayed in Milton Prell's suite at the Sahara, and he and Anne Margaret secluded themselves there for the weekend. The guys aggravated the shit out of them, as Marty Lacker recounts, Red and Lamar stuffing newspaper under the door and lighting it. They even shined butter knives till they looked like mirrors, and then they slipped them under the door to see if they could see Anne Margaret without her clothes on. They tried everything, but Elvis and Anne Margaret would not come out of that suite. "It was a very strong relationship, very intense," she has said. Elvis was so entranced by their lovemaking that he later had a round bed made for her in pink. But when word leaked out about it, Elvis made sure not to be seen with her at industry events. He invited Yvonne Craig to go with him to the screening of the film, and when she pried him for information, he was very circumspect about the whole thing. Viva Las Vegas was an immediate hit, topping Blue Hawaii as Elvis's highest-grossing film ever. By 1969, revenues would reach $5.5 million, up from Elvis's usual movie gross of $3 million. Colonel Parker might have been expected to see that spending money for bigger co-stars, bankable directors, and an involving script would ensure longevity for his client. But during production, he constantly harped that Viva Las Vegas was over budget, which could mean a loss of profit participation, a given in each of Elvis's movie contracts. However, on several levels, Parker was also greatly worried about Anne Margaret. The artful manager was nervous about what she might have told Elvis about the way other managers worked, that they took far less than the 50% that Parker commanded on some of his deals. And the Colonel was unhappy that director Sidney seemed intent on awarding Anne Margaret as much screen time as Elvis. He grumbled that the director gave her more close-ups and flattering camera angles, and complained that it was difficult to tell just whose film it was. He also nixed special billing for her in the advertisements that MGM hoped would help draw audiences beyond Elvis's core fans. "If someone else should ride on our back," Parker huffed, then we should get a better saddle." Parker may have been looking after his client, but he was particularly short-sighted in insisting that the director cut the couple's duets down from 3 to 1. The news didn't go over well with RCA either, remembered Joan Deary, who was then Steve Schultz's secretary. There was no cut of Anne Margaret on the Viva Las Vegas product because the Colonel did not believe that anyone should cash in on Elvis's popularity. Though several of the Anne Margaret songs have appeared since Elvis's death, there was never any female singer on any of Elvis's albums with the exception of Nancy Sinatra, Your Groovy Self, from Speedway, and that was because of the Colonel's friendship with Frank. We had no influence on what songs went into the movies, and no choice of what the selections were going to be in that soundtrack album. The movie years were the worst years for Elvis's music that we ever had. There were a few exceptions, but most of the songs were ridiculous. Viva Las Vegas was, indeed, an exception, with the title song becoming one of the most recognizable and popular songs in the Presley canon. Elvis also sang the rest of the soundtrack with new enthusiasm, but Parker still seemed oblivious as to how the movie resuscitated his client's spirits and musical dynamism. None of that was lost on Priscilla, however, because by the time the cast and crew returned to Los Angeles, the press had picked up on Elvis's relationship with Anne Margaret, the inspiration for his creative renewal. They hold hands. They disappear into his dressing room between shots. They lunch together in seclusion, Bob Thomas wrote in an Associated Press story that summer. And they talked marriage, she admits. But Elvis had stalling to do, both in Hollywood and in Memphis. Earlier, he had described Anne Margaret to Priscilla, now 18, as merely a typical Hollywood starlet. Then, one afternoon, she picked up the Memphis Press Scimitar and read a story headlined, "It looks like romance for Elvis and Anne Margaret." That evening, she grilled him on the phone. "Is there anything to it?" she demanded. "Hell no," he lied, and then repeated his mantra that reporters blew everything out of proportion. "She comes around here mostly on weekends on her motorcycle. She hangs out and jokes with the guys. That's it." But Priscilla's intuition told her otherwise. She knew he had little affairs all the time, but the fact that everybody called Anne Margaret the female Elvis, and that she had the same effect on men that Elvis had on women, scared her. How could he resist that, his equal? That one affected her tremendously, Joe confirms. She was very, very upset. She couldn't believe it, and she was very concerned that he was not going to marry her. I can't even think what was going through her mind. That had to be very tough for her. Billy Smith says that Elvis and Priscilla had many arguments about Anne Margaret, usually upstairs in his room at Graceland. Then Priscilla came up with a new strategy. She watched Anne Margaret's movies and learned some of her dance moves, then began dressing like her and doing her hair like hers too. Billy's wife, Jo Smith, tried to help her and told Billy she'd stand in front of a full-length mirror just cussing Anne Margaret, all the time trying to be as much like her as possible. It was pitiful. Soon she enrolled in the Patricia Stevens Finishing School in Memphis. But she also began emulating some of Elvis's behavior, pursuing 17-year-old Mylon Lefevre of the gospel group The Singing Lefevres. The first time she met the wild-haired teen backstage at Ellis Auditorium, Marty Lacker's wife, Patsy, went with her and was stunned to see Priscilla openly flirt with him. After that, Patsy refused to go with her, as did Jo Smith. She went down to the auditorium every time Mylon came to town, says Marty. Once Mylon found out Priscilla was Elvis Presley's girlfriend, he made himself unavailable. When Elvis began his next picture, Kissin' Cousins, in October, Priscilla insisted on accompanying him. She loved Los Angeles, and she'd grown tired of the stultifying pace of Memphis when Elvis wasn't home. But most of all, she was there to size up the competition, knowing full well that Anne Margaret was still in Elvis's life, even though Viva Las Vegas had wrapped 6 weeks before. She made sure to wear her 5-star diamond on her ring finger. But 2 days after Priscilla's arrival, Anne Margaret stunned the entertainment world with a syndicated UPI interview from London, where she was attending the royal premiere of Bye Bye Birdie. She was in love with Elvis, she announced, but she didn't know if they would marry. Priscilla was hurt, humiliated, and livid. And when Elvis told her the colonel thought she should return to Memphis until the publicity died down, "Honey, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave," she finally broke. "What's going on here?" she wrote in her memoir. "I'm tired of these secrets, telephone calls, notes, newspapers." She picked up a vase of flowers and threw it, watching it shatter against the wall. "I hate her," she yelled. "Why doesn't she keep her ass in Sweden where she belongs?" Elvis went on the offensive. "Look, goddammit, I didn't know this was going to get out of hand. I want a woman who's going to understand that things like this might just happen." He looked at her hard. "Are you going to be her or not?" "I stared back at him, furious and defiant," she wrote, hating him for what he was putting me through. But in the end, she went home, wanting to please him, wanting not to disappoint her parents. When President John F. Kennedy was assassinated later that month, Elvis watched the awful aftermath with Anne Margaret, not Priscilla. Kissin' Cousins, in which Elvis plays dual roles as a dark-haired, upright military man, Josh, and a blonde hillbilly Lothario, Jody, was in some ways a new take on his own story. Producer Sam Katzman, known in Hollywood as King of the Quickies for his low-budget pictures and tight shooting schedules, filmed it in 17 days. Parker had asked for him after the experience on Viva Las Vegas. He didn't much care what Katzman's product was like, as long as most of the money ended up on the Colonel's side of the equation. While the film was in production, Parker negotiated a $750,000 contract with Allied Artists for Tickle Me. Another slight picture, it would sacrifice quality production values, known actors, and even new music. The soundtrack would be made up of previously recorded songs to pay half the budget and salary to the star. Like Tickle Me, Kissin' Cousins, with a budget of $800,000, compared to $4 million for Blue Hawaii, would be an embarrassment to Elvis, especially as the finale prominently showed his stand-in, Lance Legault. "It's too expensive to shoot it over. No one will even notice," said Katzman. Many regard it as Elvis's worst picture ever. The film required Elvis to wear a light hairpiece for his twin, the character of Jody, and according to Cynthia Pepper, who played the role of Corporal Midge Riley, he hated that blonde wig. He didn't want to come out of the dressing room. He found it emasculating, and it took him back to the Elvis of old, before he reinvented himself as the suave and dark-haired leading man. But in some ways, Elvis should have felt comfortable on the set. For a few days, at least, he enjoyed a triumvirate of women who recreated the psychological setup he enjoyed with his mother, and, by extension, Jessie Guerin. Yvonne Craig, cast in the role of Azalea, Josh's girlfriend, had already proven herself a Gladys substitute. In blonde Cynthia Pepper, whom he dated and requested after seeing her in the TV series Margie, he found a replica and a peer. And when Priscilla was on set, he had his child to rear and shelter. As Cynthia noted, everybody had a different relationship with him. When we did the scene where he sings to me, we were out in Big Bear Lake, and we had a pause. It was sprinkling a little bit, and we were talking, and he said, "I don't know what I'm doing here." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean making all these movies. I should be back home driving a truck." He watched over Cynthia, who was 23 but young and naive, by her account. When producer Katzman repeatedly made innuendos about the two of them having spent the night together, he said, "Why didn't you wake me up when the alarm went off?" And I would just die with embarrassment because it wasn't true. Elvis put the funny man in his place. "Hey, that's enough. Leave her alone." Elvis was not above pulling his own prank on her, though. The script calls for Cynthia's character to flip him over her shoulder, and they rehearsed the scene over and over. One time I flipped him, and no one was around, and he didn't get up. He had his eyes shut, and it was like he'd hit his head and he was out. The only thing I could think of was, oh my God, I killed Elvis. He let it go for a minute or two, which seemed like forever, and then he said, "Gotcha." If he hated making the film, which Cynthia later heard, She didn't see it at the time. He was always professional, knowing everybody's lines, and showing up for the over-the-shoulder shots that most stars would leave for the stand-ins. Yvonne, too, was impressed with him, seeing he was such a natural actor that he didn't appear to be working at all. I've only seen that with one other person, and that was Spencer Tracy. You'd think, he's just putting in his time and not doing anything. Then you'd go to the dailies, and he'd be so riveting that you couldn't look at anybody else. As on, it happened at the World's Fair. Elvis invited Yvonne over to the house for dinner, teasing her about her big sunglasses and calling her Bug. Again, they ended upstairs in his playpen of a bedroom, back where he shouldn't be taking women, this time to watch a Katharine Hepburn movie. Yvonne continued to give him all kinds of unsolicited advice, that perhaps he should dye his hair dark brown, because his was so shiny black that it ate the light. He said he would think about it, and that he ought to take on some meaty roles again, since all his movies had him bursting into song like an operetta. She saw how he could sit on a set and know what everyone was doing and why. If you are that observant, she told him, and you understand everybody's motivation, it just makes for a whole depth that you could bring to almost every character. But he was tired of hearing it, tired of fighting. I don't make any of those decisions, he said, and the next time she looked over at him, he had drifted off to sleep. I figured I needed to get out of there, so I went around and, like a good fairy, shut off the TV and all the lights and quietly tiptoed out of his room. As I was walking down the hall, Joe Esposito was coming to see if I would like to go home. I said to him, "Listen, Elvis fell asleep. I shut out all of the lights, but he needs to get undressed." And Joe said, "You shut out all of the lights?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, Elvis likes to sleep with the light on." And I said, "How would I know that? I'm not his mother." We laughed, and he said, "I'll fix it." And then we went on downstairs. But when they opened the door, there were 5 Bel Air patrol cars in the drive, and at least that many officers pointing guns right at their hearts. Joe looked at Yvonne. "Did you touch a button up by the top of the bed?" "I touched all of the buttons until the lights went out," she said meekly, not realizing she had inadvertently pushed a panic button that summoned the cops. The next day on the set, I was sitting in my chair, and Elvis sheepishly came up and said, "I hear you called the police because I went to sleep in your face." They never worked together again, but Yvonne would see Elvis around Hollywood now and then. Sometimes they would pass each other in Beverly Hills, and he would lean out the window and yell, "Hey, Bug." She loved it. During Priscilla's brief time on the Kissin' Cousins set, she impressed the cast and crew in various ways. One of the actresses found her chilly. Not a bit of warmth there. Elvis had it all. But Yvonne thought just the opposite. She was very poised, and she was just a baby. She said to me, "I was so jealous of you during It Happened at the World's Fair, but I'm not now." She said, "I thought you were a threat." And I went, "Wow, it takes a lot of guts to say that to somebody, especially at her age." But Priscilla, who had spent so much of her life concealing her true emotions, did a fine job of masking her insecurity. "I always felt worn out because there were such emotional highs and lows," she would say nearly 30 years later. "There was never really any time that I let my guard down."